Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for part 5 of episode 300 of Last Born in the Wilderness. I am your host, Patrick Farnsworth. If you have listened to the previous parts of this series so far, you'll kind of know what I'm trying to do here with these various parts. I'm covering various themes that I've covered over the past couple years doing the previous 100 episodes of this podcast. This has been a way for me personally to make sense of what I've been doing for the past couple years as I've produced all of these hours of interviews and episodes that I've put out into the world. This part in particular is building on what I have discussed over the previous 2 parts. All of these parts are really intertwined and they all build on each other in a lot of different ways, these 3 parts in particular. And so to sort of conclude these 3 parts, this part is going to be dealing with the rise of fascism, reactionary far-right politics in the United States, and it's all going to culminate in pointing to what happened on January 6th at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. As Donald Trump he had lost the election last year. He, of course, had stated for months and months in advance that it's possible that if he did lose, that it would be fraudulent, that he could never lose because obviously he's the greatest president ever, and it would be a complete and total fraudulent move on the part of whoever to steal the election from him, right? He had placed this idea in the minds of his followers months, if not even years before the election happened in November of 2020. Now, Trump is very good at that. Trump is very good at placing ideas in the minds of people. And of course, he's been lying compulsively for so long that he has created a sort of alternate reality in which he can promote false narratives about what is actually happening. So he was able to use that in full effect. Ultimately, what we saw happen on January 6th was an explosive example of that, where you had thousands and thousands and thousands of people get riled up at a rally that he was holding. He had directed people towards the Capitol building. All these people, these MAGA followers, they all made their way up to the Capitol building. They broke in. They fought with police. I think about 5 people died in total. Of course, there was a lot of property damage. Things were stolen, like politicians' laptops. And we saw something that has just never happened before in U.S. history. And I want to be clear here. I use the term coup or coup attempt to describe what happened on January 6th. There are people that I'm going to be featuring in this part that may not use that term or may not even think it was anything like a coup. I personally, from my own analysis, my own perspective that of course I'm asserting here, I personally think that this was a coup attempt. It wasn't done very well, I will say. It wasn't like it was well managed or well executed by any means. But I think it was one of those things where now that we know that it can happen, if you have things set up in a certain way, you can actually foment these types of events to occur. We have in the United States reached a point where there is what you could describe as a nascent fascist movement. I don't know how coherent it is as far as fascism goes, but it most definitely has the elements of fascism. And there are many elements of fascism now that have become a part of the mainstream political discourse. Policies that are being enacted by Republicans, and I will say a lot of Democrats are completely complicit in this as well. So it's worth understanding that whether or not what happened on January 6th was an actual coup attempt is to me not as relevant as actually just pointing to the fact that it was a precursor, it was an indication, it was a way to demonstrate something that we should be very cognizant of. You know, when Donald Trump ran for president in 2020, at the very end of 2020 last year, he got way more votes than he did back in 2016. Of course, Joe Biden won, but nonetheless, a significant portion of the U.S. population is completely comfortable with what Trump did during his presidency. They found him to be a competent enough leader to be reelected, which says a lot. Again, a lot of people didn't vote for him. That is most definitely true. More people voted for the other person, Joe Biden. That being said, there is a significant section of the U.S. population that are completely okay with the xenophobia, the racism, the sexism, the outright violence that Trump exhibited during his administration. And that really says a lot about this country. It really says a lot about the culture of the United States. It really says a lot about how this isn't just Trump. Trump is a symptom of a deeper problem that I don't think can be resolved. I think that this is as old as the United States itself, and that everything that has led up to this point was, I don't want to say inevitable. Obviously, we could have taken different paths, but based on the fact that the United States is a white supremacist, settler-colonial project, as we face these crises that we have experienced and will continue to experience into the future, people are going to continue to lean more and more in this sort of reactionary, nativist direction. People are going to continue to endorse these views, and these parties, these political parties like the Republican Party, are going to continue to integrate and adopt more of these policies and perspectives into their platforms. And that is the direction we're heading in. So certainly we have a Democratic president right now, and we could argue that that is better than the alternative. I can see the argument in that. But I think we need to really be aware of the fact that the people that fomented that siege on the Capitol, they're still operating with full autonomy in the U.S. political system. And yeah, we're not doing anything to really deal with that. So this part in particular is going to be addressing this trend, this thing that is really disturbing to witness and to observe unfold. And while certainly it culminated in the attack on the Capitol on the 6th, I'm going to be providing more context as to how we got to this point. So it's really going to just be a way to make sense of what ultimately happened on that day. It was a flashpoint. And again, this is a precursor of things to come. And what happened on the 6th is going to happen again in some form or another. It may not happen in that fashion, but because that happened, because it was demonstrated that it could actually happen, that the United States Capitol could be invaded by hordes of people, we could see something similar happen in the coming years. And I think we really need to prepare ourselves for that possibility and whatever that means for the future. So to build on this, to really set the stage for this part, I would like to feature an interview I did with Noam Chomsky. I did this interview back in November of 2019. So this was some time ago. It's about over a year and a half ago at this point, obviously before the pandemic hit. I don't know, do I really need to introduce Noam Chomsky? I'll just say Noam Chomsky is a world-renowned political dissident linguist and the author of numerous books. I feel really fortunate that I was able to speak with Noam Chomsky. He was really influential for me. Growing up, as I became more politicized in my teenage years, some of the first books that I read that really opened my eyes to the nature of the U.S. empire, U.S. foreign policy, the way the media works, how propaganda works and operates in the United States. Chomsky was instrumental in that education for me. So it was really a deep honor. I felt very fortunate that I had the chance to speak with this man. So I'll just state this. We talk about the current state and trajectory of the United States empire within the broader scope of recent history. We then move into discussing journalism. And of course, as I mentioned, this was recorded back in November of 2019. So to highlight this point, we focus on the current situation of WikiLeaks founder and editor Julian Assange, who is still currently imprisoned in the high-security Belmarsh prison in London. At that point, he was waiting for an extradition hearing after his asylum was revoked by the Ecuadorian government and handed over to British authorities April of 2019. As Professor Chomsky states in this interview, Assange basically is being murdered by the British government, and that seems to be very true. The conditions that he has lived in since he was forced out of the embassy, which wasn't great either, but being forced in Belmarsh prison has not been great. His health has declined tremendously during his time in the embassy and in that prison. So I ask him what it means for someone like Assange, who is not a U.S. citizen, who is an Australian citizen, who is a journalist, who is an editor, who has released classified U.S. documents, which has been published in numerous prestigious papers like the New York Times, like the Guardian, like the Washington Post, like those in so many other papers around the world, what it means to have a publisher like WikiLeaks attacked like this, to have an individual like Assange attacked like this, regardless of your personal feelings about him, what does it mean for journalism that the United States can go after somebody like this and use governments like the British government to go after him in this fashion? I mean, this really shows the state of journalism right now. This is all really important to understand, that as what we witnessed happen with the Trump administration, as what we witnessed in previous administrations, and what we're seeing now with the Biden administration, that really the groundwork is being laid for a truly authoritarian paradigm to really take hold, if it hasn't already. The first thing I wanted to discuss was, I guess, your general sense of what's going on geopolitically with the United States. I guess the very general question I would ask right away is, do you get this sense that the United States as a global empire, as a military geopolitical force in the world, is expanding, or is it a stable entity, or is it in decline? What is your general sense based on the trends of what's going on in that realm?
Well, if we look over the long term, the United States has been in decline since 1945. The U.S. had reached the peak of its power in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. In fact, a level of power that had never existed in world history. The United States it was far and away the richest country in the world. It had gained enormously through the war. Industrial production quadrupled. The United States was, of course, untouched by the war. Its rivals had been seriously harmed or destroyed. It had probably 50% of world wealth. Statistics weren't very good in those days, but something roughly like that. Security was incomparable, controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. It was just incomparable. But it started to decline right away. The first step was in 1949 when China became independent. In the United States, that's called loss of China, which is a pretty revealing expression. It was assumed that we own the world, and the loss of China was a terrible event. It goes on. By the 1970s, the world economy was pretty much tripolar, with US-based North America, German-based Europe, at that time Japan-based Northeast Asia, already the most dynamic region, now later China and the East Asian Tigers. And US share of global income had declined to maybe 25%, which is still enormous, but not like 45. If we proceed further, pretty much the same tendencies. But there are militarily, of course, the U.S. is just totally incomparable. I mean, no other country has 800 military bases around the world. Nobody has even a dozen. If you look at global power, the U.S. is, again, incomparable. You can see it very clearly in the use of sanctions. No other country can impose sanctions. The U.S. can impose sanctions wherever it wants, and it forces other countries to adhere to them, because the U.S. controls the global financial system. There's another change that's taken place during the neoliberal globalization process. The national income, which is what is usually measured, doesn't mean as much as it used to. A different measure, and maybe more insightful measure of global power, is the amount of global wealth owned by domestically based multinationals. And if you look at those figures, it's astonishing. US-based multinationals control about half of world wealth, and by now the statistics are good. they're first in practically every category. This is changing somewhat under Trump's wrecking ball. We don't know exactly how that'll work out, but it's fundamentally the same. So, yes, the U.S. is still the dominant global power, but it has limits that it didn't have in the past.
I guess I want to point to, I guess the next thing that I would like to discuss is the state of journalism, and particularly whistleblowing in this time. I want to point to Julian Assange, at least at first, and get your thoughts on what's currently unfolding with him. He is now in he's in Belmarsh prison in London. He's been there since April, since he was forcefully removed from the Ecuadorian embassy and the asylum that he had there. There was recently a report that came out where he was in court. The report says that he was fighting back tears. He said he couldn't think properly. He couldn't understand the court proceedings. He had a hard time even recalling, I think, his own name, the date, even. What do you make of this case, and not just of him, but also how the media has, in a general sense, the U.S. media in particular, has covered what's happening to Assange and WikiLeaks and whistleblowing in general?
U.S. media and the British media as well. Assange is basically being murdered by the British government. He's held, his being sequestered in the Ecuadorian embassy was bad enough. The embassy, incidentally, I visited him there as a kind of like a small apartment. He was basically stuck in one or two rooms, couldn't even, in many ways, it's worse than being in prison. At least prisoners are allowed to go into the yard and see the sun. He couldn't go out. It was plainly psychologically very difficult. It would be for anyone. Now after the right-wing government in Ecuador expelled him, he was taken over by the British. He's in a high-security prison under very harsh conditions. All of this for the crime of skipping bail. Usually you get a fine for that. And his treatment, the people who've seen him at that court scene that you mentioned and have visited him, and say that his health is sharply deteriorating, and he's being treated in a way which is basically destroying him. There is an extradition hearing coming up. How it'll turn out, I don't know. The British will probably extradite him to the United States, where he'll be tried with crimes that even theoretically can lead to the death sentence. But he's already practically suffering it. And as for the media, they're simply supporting this, or either not reporting it or saying, yeah, it's the right thing, because he's a hideous criminal who revealed to the world things that the U.S. government doesn't want populations to know. Should be regarded as, meanwhile, the same media eagerly exploit the revelations that come out from WikiLeaks. So that's basically what I have to say about Assange.
Is there any legal precedent to this, though? I feel like what's happening is extra legal, as in this is not something that's been. It's like what they're doing seems to be outside of the bounds of international law. Is that true? Or is this something that can be seen as a precedent? Is there something we can look to in the past as being an example of what they're doing today?
It's probably not technical. There are, it's the UN rapporteur on torture has described it as in violation of conventions on torture and treatment of prisoners. But whether that's violation of international law, you could debate. However, talking about international law is a bit of a joke. There are gross violations of international law that nobody even mentions. So in this century, the most extreme violation of international law was the US UK invasion of Iraq. That's a textbook example of aggression with no credible pretext. It's what the Nuremberg Tribunal and general international law regard as the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes in that it encompasses the totality of what happens then and afterwards, would include the creation of the breakup of Iraq, the killing of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of refugees, inciting ethnic conflicts which have spread, tearing the whole region apart, leading to the birth of ISIS and so on. That's an extraordinary international crime. Has anybody said anything about it?
Yeah, no.
International law is for the weak.
Okay. And so, I mean, this really comes back to the threat, the implications of what this court case is, this extradition hearing for Assange. What is this, do you think? Do you think the long-term implications of this, as far as our ability to have whistleblowers, the kind of information that journalists are able to use in general? I mean, that's kind of one of the fears about whether or not you love or hate Assange as a person and what he may have done personally as a publisher of this information. The real fear is that it's going to have a real impact on the freedom of press. Do you get that sense, or is that already long gone? Are we way past that point?
I'm afraid it's another case, and an extreme case, of the use of state power. The U.S. in the background, but Britain as the country that's implementing it. Use of state power to punish the release to the public of information that power systems don't want them to have.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what it amounts to.
Okay.
And yes, that's certainly a message to journalists everywhere. Not that it's new. It's by no means the first time, even the most extreme. After all, people have been deported, imprisoned, all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So is this, I guess just to point to this, I mean, is this an indication that we are past a point where real substantial journalism is being thoroughly undermined and threatened? I mean, I really think about what it means to be a journalist in an authoritarian state, and what the real risks that come with doing real journalism is right now. It's rather bleak, I guess, and I just wanted to get your sense of what what people who are getting into journalism right now, what they can really expect and what they're coming up against.
Well, it's I wouldn't say it's crossed the border. We've been through much worse in the past. So take Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, 1990, right after the First World War. I mean, about thousands of people were deported. The independent press was virtually crushed. It was a massive attack on human rights. The so-called McCarthy period was about the same. The Trump period is innovating in a way which is familiar from totalitarian states. The entire system in the United States under Trump is becoming a kind of proto-fascism without the ideology, just the pertinences of fascism. One of those is to totally destroy the information system so that the concept of truth, fact, accuracy just fades into oblivion. And the way they're doing it is just by flooding the information system with fakery. perfectly conscious lying, deceit on every imaginable topic, trivial or important, to the point where people just kind of have to sort of abandon the effort to try to find out what's true or false. Of course, you can still do it if you work at it, but for much of the population, it means that the whole concept of accuracy, truth, fact, and so on kind of dissolves. That's a very effective way of undermining public engagement in any of the decisions that matter in the world. In other words, it's destroying democratic function. And Trump is a master at it. It's working very well. He's got a kind of an adoring constituency for whom he can do no wrong. Facts are what he says. There may be around 40% of the population or more. Very solid base. The Republican Party is terrified if that base won't do anything to cross Trump, who's their god. Some sectors of it, like evangelicals, who are a big segment of the population in the United States, are almost totally in line in support of their hero and so on. This is it's wrong to describe this as fascism. Gives it too much credit. Has basically no ideology behind it. The ideology for Trump is just me, whatever's important for me. But it has some of the features of totalitarian systems and undermining the media and creating anger, distrust regarding the media as some kind of enemy. That's a good way to undermine democratic function.
So it's funny to say this because before I played that segment of my interview with Professor Chomsky, I of course talked about the enormous influence that he's had on me, and I generally agree with him on pretty much every point he made. Obviously, he helped give me a deeper historical perspective regarding the attack on journalism, the attack on the free press, the way that propaganda operates, and so on, right? That's all true. At the end there, he talks about fascism, and I just want to make a point here, which is that it doesn't necessarily contradict anything that I'm going to be exploring in this part. But what I think is important here is, and I don't know if Chomsky has stated this or not, or if this has been said elsewhere, but that Trump himself may not be a fascist. He nonetheless has helped build a base of support that lends itself to fascism. And I think that's the key here. I don't think we should dismiss it as anything less than that. There are technical definitions that are used to describe what Trump is and what his movement, the MAGA movement, is in the United States. But as we will get into later on, as we explore this subject more, as I feature more interviews in this part, I think it'll make more sense as to why I personally think it's appropriate to call it some kind of fascism. The next person I'm going to feature actually describes it as a form of neo-fascism or a form of neoliberal fascism, because the fascism of the 21st century and the fascism of the United States right now is not the fascism of the 20th century. This isn't Hitler's Nazi party. This isn't National Socialism, as they called it, or the Italian fascism that emerged in the 1930s, or anything like that. Fascism is, just like so many other movements, is predicated on the conditions of the time and place that it exists in. So the next person that I would like to feature is going to build on the point of how we have come to this place in this time. And I really think it's important to provide this type of context because, again, this didn't emerge out of nowhere. This has been something that has been building for decades, if not longer. The next person that I would like to feature is with Henry Giroux. Henry is McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in the Public Interest and the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. And the time this interview was recorded, which was also recorded in late 2019, he had released a book called The Terror of the Unforeseen. And what I wrote for this episode was, How has neoliberalism paved the way for the rise of far-right ideologies and populists around the world, as demonstrated in the elections of and the policies enacted by such leaders as Donald Trump in the United States, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Viktor Orban in Hungary? A neoliberal fascism is emerging globally. As Henry elaborates in his book, The Terror of the Unforeseen, neoliberalism creates an all-encompassing market guided by the principles of privatization, deregulation, commodification, and the free flow of capital. Advancing these agendas, it weakens unions, radically downsizes the welfare state, and wages an assault on public services such as education, libraries, parks, energy, water, prisons, and public transportation. As the state is hollowed out, big corporations take on the functions of government, imposing severe austerity measures, redistributing wealth upward to the rich and powerful, and reinforcing a notion of society as one of winners and losers. To further this point more succinctly, he states, neoliberalism has become an incubator for a growing authoritarian populism fed largely by economic inequality. As societies become subsumed politically, economically, and culturally by the logic of a neoliberal ideology, the outcome is widespread social fragmentation and disintegration. This in turn has manifested into a groundswell of authoritarian and fascist politics in nations that have been traditionally defined as open and free democratic societies. Unless we critically address neoliberal capitalism and the impact this ideology has played in lives of countless human beings across the world, we cannot even begin to adequately understand and effectively resist this trend of rising far-right populist movement globally. Okay, so that's a fairly good description of what we talk about in this segment in particular, but also something to note here. Like I said, Trump didn't come from nowhere, and people like to maybe categorize Trump in a separate box, like he doesn't fit in with other presidents that we've had, like Obama before him or previous presidents. Certainly, he is different in very important ways, but there's a reason he got elected. It wasn't an aberration. He is just as much a part of the American politic as anything else. It was almost an inevitability that somebody like him would achieve that position of power.
Yeah, and getting back again, just using the kind of the hollowing out of public education. In what way has this created a society? I know there's a lot of resistance to this, and on the local and maybe on the broader scale as well. But I do see this sense that people's general understanding of things, of the direction we're going politically in this country, speaking in the United States specifically. That much of that is sort of this lack of critical thinking, lack of historical context, kind of infantilizing. I sort of see this sort of infantilizing sort of thing where people can't really seem to get their head around certain trends or topics, and I wonder how much of that is due to the hollowing out, due to neoliberal economic and social policies in public education. People basically. Yeah, you describe memorization, testing as being the focus of schools. How much is that? I mean, in whatever way we can maybe try to fit this in, but how has that trend led to a population which is, seemingly, because I see much of the rise of authoritarian and fascist tendencies coming from what we would define as the working class. You can't really have a successful populist right-wing movement without a gang of supporters. So how has the hollowing out of public education through neoliberalism maybe paved the way in many ways for a rising right-wing populism?
I mean, I think that when you look at the attack on public education, you're also looking at something else. The attack on public education becomes a model for an attack on civic culture. It becomes a model for attack on all those public institutions that basically raise the bar intellectually and theoretically in terms of giving people an opportunity to understand the conditions under which they find themselves and to be able to act on those conditions, not just individually, but also collectively. I mean, remember, you have a culture that is so steeped in a consumerist ethic that it panders in many ways to a kind of anti-intellectualism that gives rise to a whole range of cultural spheres that replace, in my estimation, spheres that are engaged in what I would call the intellectual pursuit of the capacity for having a real sense of engaged agency. I mean, you have a culture now that you have a society governed by celebrity culture. This is a culture of stupidity and idiocy. You have a culture dominated by game shows. You have a culture in which, in many ways, reality TV becomes the ultimate model that mimics a sort of neoliberalism understanding of a kind of deranged sort of what I would call competitive and highly regressive notion of individualism. You have this notion of privatization that endlessly says that, it's impossible to translate, to go back real problems into larger systemic issues. You have this incredible fragmentation in the culture. And it seems to me that this culture of self-absorption that's encouraged by the new technologies, how the modern media increasingly blurs the distinction between fact and fiction. And I guess what I'm getting at is that the attack on public education is really nothing more than a microcosm of the attack on all those institutions that produce a formative culture that operates off the assumption that you can have a democracy without informed citizens. That formative culture has now been transformed into a regressive, privatized, commodified culture. And I think in that sense, the mobilizing passions of fascism have been unleashed in a culture of ignorance in which people want to blame other people for the problems that they have. They increasingly embrace a notion of leadership in which they believe in the great man who will save them. They believe in simplistic answers. James Baldwin once said, one of the great tragedies of any society is the merging of anti-intellectualism, ignorance, and power. And I think that's what we've seen happen under neoliberalism since the 1980s in the United States.
Okay. Well, and I want to point to because again, I think that it's important to understand where a figure like Trump, who is seemingly catalyzing many of these things that you've just discussed in our society. But I think something that I really want to point to is the ways in which, you talk about the ways in which language, dehumanizing language, sets the stage for this sort of dehumanization that we're seeing right now. There's us versus them kind of thing that we're seeing. And I want to point to the ways in which not just Trump, who's so obvious about his disdain for minorities, immigrants, people that he views as the other. But I want to talk about, say, the ways that previous presidencies, previous leaders that we've had, like Obama or Clinton or Bush or any of these previous presidencies that we've had that have definitely furthered the neoliberal economic and social agendas. But they were they were very polite politicians, I guess you could say, compared to what we have with Trump. If I could ask about the ways in which a sort of a neoliberal language has been used to set the stage for this rising fascism and authoritarianism in the United States, and maybe using examples from presidents that we don't normally associate with that, like Obama, for instance. What is some of the language that's used to do that?
I mean, look, Reagan began his presidency attacking welfare queens. I mean, Reagan began as a governor, basically traded in red baiting, particularly around somebody like Angela Davis. I mean, when you look at Bush, the first Bush, I mean, he gave us the Willie Horton ads. When you look at the way in which Cheney and that Bush regime emerged with its endless lies, its implicit coded sexism and racism, you have to understand something, and that is that fascism starts with language, and it starts with the language of brutality, which essentially, if used long enough, becomes normalized. I mean, there's a long tradition in the United States in which this neoliberal narrative of separating people along lines of friends and enemy has always been racially and class and gender coded. It was just hidden a bit. It seems to me with some of these people. I mean, it wasn't as overt as it is, of course, with Trump. I mean, Trump brings the surface elements of this language of fascism to the center of politics. That's what he does. I mean, the origins of the fascism in terms of its ultranationalism, its attempt at the discourse of decline, its contempt not just for liberalism but for intellectual thought, the claim that America is always in crisis, the contempt for weakness. I mean, what this language, particularly since the 1980s, has produced is not only a racist ecosystem, a class-based hatred of justice and equality, but it also has produced a language of disposability and a culture of cruelty that is unlike anything we have seen. I mean, look, let's go back to somebody like Clinton. I mean, people talk about Clinton as the great savior because there was a somewhat of an economic boom during his regime. Clinton, to me, in many ways, was horrible in terms of what he did around expanding the punishment state, imposing laws around 3 strikes and you're out, a law and order agenda that put millions, hundreds of thousands of people of color in prison. What he did to dismantle basically the economy by going after the Glass-Steagall Act, what he did by attacking welfare rolls. I mean, these are all instances of a language that basically sees the other as excess, that sees the other as disposable, that sees the other as non-human in some way. This is the language, Patrick, of objectification. It's a language of reification. And when you dehumanize people and you reify them long enough, that language operates in the service of violence. I mean, think about Trump's language, which is right out. I mean, this is the language of war. This is the language of hatred. It's the language of ethnic cleansing. It's the language of racial purity. It's the language of white supremacy. I mean, it's a language in which certain groups are seen as not only expendable, but actually when he says as he recently allegedly claimed that border guards should shoot immigrants in the legs, or accuses people in Congress or anybody who disagrees with him of treason. I mean, this is the language of war. This is the language of war. This is a contempt for people who disagree. It elevates instinct over emotion. It's anti-intellectual. It has a contempt. It exhibits a contempt for the rule of law. And it harbors an enormous fear of what we call the other. It's an elimination language. And what scares me is that the misery imposed by neoliberalism, with its massive engine of social death, its massive engine of basically human suffering and misery, its endless production of massive inequalities in wealth and power, has now paved the way for a kind of neo-fascist discourse that merges with racial purity, white supremacy, and ethnic cleansing.
Okay. Well, I want to kind of talk a little more about language because there was a part in the article that I mentioned that you had published in Truth Out, in which we talk about how right-wing populists create diversions and distract away from neoliberal inequities. I'll just quote something really quick here, just to set the stage here. You say, "In a masterful act of political diversion, populist leaders attacked all vestiges of liberal capitalism while refusing to name neoliberal inequities in wealth and power as a basic threat to their societies. Instead of calling for an acceleration of the democratic ideals of popular sovereignty and equality, right-wing populist leaders such as Trump, Bolsonaro, and Hungary's Viktor Orban defined democracy as the enemy of those who wish for unaccountable power. They also diverted genuine popular anger into the abyss of cultural chauvinism, anti-immigrant hatred, and a contempt of Muslims, and a targeted attack on the environment, healthcare, education, public institutions, social provisions, and other basic life resources." So I think this is interesting because it's like something that I kind of sensed as Trump was gearing up for the election was a sense that he was talking about, globalization in a sense, or globalism, I guess, is kind of the word I hear often on the right when we talk about a global economic system. So he was speaking to, for instance, so-called free trade agreements as undermining, U.S. sovereignty and empowerment of workers in the United States, which is something that's actually true, right? But of course, then it's a diversion after that. It's not actually addressing the underlying structure of neoliberalism. You're not going to hear Trump present a well-articulated, well-researched critique of neoliberalism at all. No, he's going to blame immigrants. He's going to blame the other. He's going to use language of dehumanization in order to further his campaign and sort of build his base. So if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which right-wing populists they touch on it just enough to get people to understand, like, okay, he's on my side. He's going to use his power for me and for my own. But then divert that towards a sort of anger, resentment, a fracturing of the culture in general.
No, Patrick, you've said it more eloquently than I have. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what they have done is they've tapped into real problems in some cases that people are facing, but they've only tapped into those problems in order to mobilize the fear and the outrage in ways that benefit their own economic and political interests. That's the difference. I mean, they don't tap into outrage in ways to reveal very basic underlying economic and political factors that have produced the suffering that people have now find themselves in, whether we're talking about the desolated landscapes all over the United States that have been produced as a result of globalization, or they don't talk about the housing crisis and how poor people had to pay, and how the Obamas of the world sort of bailed out the bankers and the people from Goldman Sachs. They don't really talk about how capitalism in a sense has nothing to do with the needs of the people that they're concerned about. I mean, I think that when you live in a culture marked by the kind of anti-intellectualism that we find in the United States, it becomes very easy to sort of mobilize people in ways in which you actually point to a real problem, but then you divert the issue in ways to suggest, don't worry, I alone can solve this problem, when in fact, the people who are arguing that are basically people who believe in a value system that has produced the problem. I mean, Trump claims he's for the working people. He's going to produce infrastructure. He's going to, in a sense, do something about health care, and so forth and so on. When in fact, what he's done is pass regressive tax measures that benefit the rich. He's deregulated all kinds of safety and business and ecological policies that are going to hurt poor people because their children are going to suffer under a debased ecosystem that's collapsing. He has no interest whatsoever in addressing the healthcare system, except to make it more difficult for people to actually get health insurance. And so it seems to me you have a switch and bait discourse here. At one level, we point to some of capitalism's problems, particularly global capitalism. At another level, we mobilize those fears, genuine fears in some cases, on the part of people who are suffering from these problems, in ways that completely divert the issue by blaming Mexicans, by blaming immigrants, by blaming Muslims. And so, in a sense, what you have here is you have the merging of the problems caused by global neoliberalism with, in fact, the appropriation of a fascist politics that trades in white supremacy, ethnic cleansing, and white nationalism. So this is a very interesting kind of move because it represents the merging in many ways of neoliberalism, fascism, neoliberal fascism, as both a project and a movement. As a project, of course, neoliberalism destroys all the commanding institutions of democracy while consolidating power in the hands of relatively few, a financial elite. And as a movement, it endlessly legitimates and further reproduces economic equality, massive suffering, the privatization of public goods, the dismantling of essential government agencies, and it individualizes social problems. And that's exactly what Trump did.
One of the major points there that I really want you to get out of that segment with Henry is how the seeds for a kind of proto-fascism or a sort of neoliberal fascism, as Henry pointed to there, that the seeds for that have been planted a long time ago. I mean, you could go back to the beginning of the neoliberal era, which began several decades ago, as Henry went over there, or we could go back even further, I think, to the beginnings of this country. We have been seeing this very deliberate erosion of any of the institutions and any of the things that really could have ameliorated the rise of this kind of reactionary right-wing populism that we saw really come into full effect under the presidency of Trump. And now that you could say the Pandora's box has been opened with someone like Trump, for instance, I think that we're going to see in the future more Trumps. We're going to see even more sophisticated fascists come into power and take advantage of the alienation, the frustration that so many people in this country are feeling and experiencing. There are many people who have very legitimate grievances. How they choose to direct their frustration and anger is of prime importance here. Now, in that part with Henry and also in that part with Noam Chomsky, I'm laying the groundwork here to get to a point that I really want to emphasize here, which is the human cost to this. The most vulnerable populations are the most immediately affected by the rise of this sort of hyper-nationalist, fascist kind of language, policies, and so on. And to that, I would like to point to two interviews. The first one that I would like to point to is with John Washington. Now, I interviewed John back in September of 2020. John is a writer, translator, and activist, and he's the author of the book The Dispossessed, A Story of Asylum at the U.S.-Mexican Border and Beyond. As I wrote here for this episode with him, at the center of The Dispossessed is the story of Arnovos, a Salvadorian man seeking asylum in the United States. As John weaves together the harrowing story of this man as he attempts to cross numerous borders and countless obstacles on his journey northward, John expands his narrative to include the deeper history and purpose of asylum, the modern bureaucratic framework potential asylees must contend with, and the details and consequences of the uniquely cruel immigration policies enacted by numerous presidential administrations, and most recently with the Trump administration and their family separation policy. As much as, quote, asylum seekers are expected to unveil themselves, to recount their histories, and to exhibit their wounds, end quote, the same cannot be said of those that are in a position to provide asylum. And to quote from his book, what we ultimately fear, what we ultimately hate, is so often an outward manifestation of our own action or inaction. As Kristeva puts it, quote, the foreigner lives within us. He is the hidden face of our identity. By recognizing him within ourselves, we are spared detesting him in himself, end quote. Dispossessing and denying the stranger or refugee does not keep us safe or in possession. It exposes us. And here I finally state, by looking at how the United States treats those escaping the most horrifying conditions imaginable, what does that expose in us? So, we're going to talk about the family separation policy that was enacted by the Trump administration, how even though it was uniquely cruel under the Trump administration to do this, how these detention centers, which are basically concentration camps at the border, how this has been building for some time in the United States. This is not the first time that the United States has put various groups of people in camps, but more recently we have seen this in the issues surrounding immigration and those that are seeking asylum from south of the U.S. border, who are coming up to the United States because the various countries in Central America have been destabilized due to a combination of U.S. foreign policy over the last century and also the effects of climate change, right? It's affecting agriculture. So people are moving into more stable regions as a result. That is one of the effects of climate disruption, is mass migration. And we're seeing, as a response to that in the United States, harsher immigration policies, these detention centers that are emerging, these really cruel policies of separating families at the border for no reason except just to be cruel and to, like, quote, send a message to these people. Of course, Trump being uniquely sadistic in his policies, we really saw one of the impacts of this sort of fascist trajectory that we're going down. We have institutionalized dehumanizing these people that, due to U.S. influence in this region, in Central America, are seeking asylum, which they absolutely have the right to do. And what does it say about us in this time? That when people need asylum, that we refuse them and that we separate them and we put children in cages, where there's so many cases of just outright abuse that is happening in these facilities. And that now that the Trump administration has ended, now that we're in the Biden administration, we essentially have the same things happening. They haven't resolved this issue. And we can see that this is only going to get worse, regardless of the administrations that we have, regardless of who we have as president. Our government's policies towards immigrants is only going to get worse. And this is a part of a trend that I think we really need to understand as being a broader movement towards authoritarianism, towards fascism as a whole. So the logic that I've heard, and I think you referenced this in the book as well, which is when Trump's policy, the Trump administration's policies around immigration, of course, it became a big deal when it was realized that ICE and, just the Border Patrol, they were detaining families, but they were separating the children from their parents in these detention centers. And then, of course, there were the many incidences of them not being able to find the parents, or the children are basically like, okay, we don't know, we didn't keep enough records, or we didn't keep track well enough to know where the children should go after being detained for however many months in these really difficult and horrible circumstances. So I think some people would maybe say, well, that's just due to bureaucratic incompetence or some kind of, oh, this is just how government, they just suck, right? They just don't work well. So why wouldn't it work? Of course it wouldn't work well for this. So, but I'm like, from my understanding, the reason why this is so bad is it's ideological, and it's just they really want them to suffer as much as possible. So could you comment on that? Was that your sense of how the Trump administration in particular has approached this subject, approached this issue around immigration? They're really seeking to make people suffer as much as possible.
So when the family separation policy was first really instituted, and I think it's also important to note that family separation has taken place for a long time. It hasn't taken place on the scale that we saw beginning in 2018, but I reported on cases of family separation during the Obama administration, and it was just as absolutely awful and torturous then, but it just wasn't at the scale that we saw beginning in 2018 and continuing today. So it was not a bureaucratic bungle that caused this. It was still a bureaucratic mess that, we saw, but it was very, very clearly intentional. And there's proof of that. And that proof is that so Jeff Sessions, the former attorney general, when he announced that there was going to be a so-called zero tolerance policy on the border, that was where they were going to prosecute all crimes, including the misdemeanor of illegal entry when you cross the border without having the being legally granted to do so. They were going to prosecute all of those crimes, even if it was committed by someone who was a parent and they had a small child with them. And then only because they were supposedly enforcing the law did they have to separate the parent from the child and, take the parent to court and prosecute them. And meanwhile, since the child was a child, they were going to put them in the safe arms. So supposedly safe arms of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee and Resettlement. But the United States government, for the incredibly massive capacity that it has to, draw misery on the bodies of migrants, it's incredibly overfunded, the agencies that are in charge with enforcing immigration law. They do not even come close to having the capacity to prosecute all illegal border crossing crimes. And they didn't in 2018 either. So in those first few months where we saw this zero tolerance policy instituted, they had to select which people to prosecute. There was 3 times as many people who crossed the border without children as people who crossed the border with children in those first few months. And they selected, nonetheless, in those first months, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but just in those first couple months, I think it bordered on about 2,000 parents who were prosecuted. They could have prosecuted as many and 3 times more of parents who had no children. Yet they selected the ones with the children to prosecute, and they prosecuted them They've separated them from their children, and in some cases, they lost track of those children. The parents were deported. The children were sent to eventually like foster or being adopted by other families, and they were never reunited. And even the ones that went through an unimaginably traumatizing experience. And yeah, again, not to fear spoilers. And I'm going to get back a little bit to the big picture of this policy in a second, but I think it's really important to understand, or try to understand, because I don't think I can. I don't think I've achieved it, understanding what it was like for people who were separated. I've reported on family separations a number of different times. Arnovis, as I mentioned, he brought his daughter with him on the last trip. They made it to the U.S.-Mexico border after another grueling, harrowing journey, the details of which I'd be glad to relate, and I do in great detail in the book. A couple days after they were put in cages in South Texas, they were separated. He was lied to by the Border Patrol and said that his daughter, she didn't fit on the bus that they were going to take him to the next location on, and that she was going to be on the next bus. They knew that she wasn't going to be on the next bus. The next day, when he was waiting for her to come, she hadn't come yet. He asked where she was. They said, "We didn't know you had a daughter." Mm. Yeah, what would that be like to hear?
I don't know.
We don't know you had a daughter and she's not with you, and we have no idea where she is. He obviously insisted that he had a daughter and that he was with her yesterday, and they separated her from him. They said, well, yeah, we'll find her, we'll figure it out. A couple days later, after waiting in this excruciating situation, they said, yeah, she's either in Florida or New York. So one of those two possibilities, Florida or New York, is where his daughter was. Meanwhile, he was still in now a detention center in Karnes in southern Texas. And that was all he heard of her for the next 30 days. He asked repeatedly, insistently, desperately, where's my daughter? What happened to my daughter? When can I see my daughter? What can I do to get my daughter back? I will sign my deportation paper now, anything at all to get my daughter back. And he didn't talk to her or know about her at all, except she's either in Florida or New York. Finally, when he was convinced that signing for his deportation to get back to El Salvador, he would be reunited with his daughter. He was reunited, and through a sort of a complicated series of connections, he met up with or he was connected to an attorney in Texas, Raíces, and they found out that his daughter actually was neither in New York or in Florida, but was in Arizona. So, and eventually she was sent back to El Salvador as well, and she was connected with him. I've talked to him and her at length, spent a lot of time with them, and I've never witnessed another instance in any reporting on trauma and like very serious, just horrible experiences that people have gone through. I've never witnessed someone just clearly be unable to express the pain that they've suffered. When he gets to that moment, to that idea of what she went through and what it was like for her to go through it, he just breaks down. It's just like so clear. It's visibly breaks down. He talks about when she recalls to him sometimes, she'll say something like, "Oh, Papa, remember when I was in prison in the United States?" Mm-hmm. And to hear a 6-year-old talk about being in prison, it's just like, what did I do to her? And he feels such just frothing crazy guilt for what he did. And he was doing it obviously in what he thought was her best interest.
Yeah.
And I've another case I talked to. Eventually, this man lost his son. He was promised repeatedly as a Honduran man that he would be reunited. His son would be returned to him. He had already signed his deportation, hoping that it would reunite them more quickly. And he had a sister in the United States in New Jersey. His son was in Chicago, and he was convinced by ICE that turning over a custody to his sister would get his son released more quickly. Mm. The paperwork for that took about 4 months. Meanwhile, I can't remember how old his son was. I think he was 4 or 5, again, really young, was 4 months alone without any family, complete strangers, in a facility in Chicago where it is a rule that the people who work in those facilities are not allowed to, unless they need to change a diaper or whatnot, touch the children. So 4 months, our child broken from his family's home and his family's contact and anyone he ever knew, not even being touched by another human being. What is going to become of this child? Eventually, he did transfer custody to his sister. The child was released, but now his son is in New Jersey. He's in Honduras, has no legal means to ever see his son again. I mean, maybe they could fly back with the son to Honduras at some point, but he left because he was scared. Just like the incredible trauma that we don't understand that we're causing these people, that they're going to grow up and how are they going to live this down?
Yeah.
It's shocking. And sorry, I know I took a sort of a long detour from the policy aspects, but I think it's just really important to hit home on how incredibly painful and traumatizing these instances, this policy is.
I mean, there's, what you're describing there with those two cases. I mean, that is, I'm sure that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of those stories.
There are.
And that's the overwhelming thing. This isn't just a fluke or an anomaly or some glitch in the system. This is the system. This is how it's meant to work.
Yes. This was a policy, an intentional policy. Yeah. And it was carried out.
Yeah.
And now right now the Trump administration is suing to try to basically try to do it again. Right now, again, the pandemic has sort of thrown everything in a little bit of chaos, but really the Trump administration also welcomed in some regard the pandemic to drive home these policies that they had been aching to really implement for their, since they came into office. But one of the other cases, there still are a number of families detained in the United States. And there's a couple so-called family detention centers, which are really just mothers and young children because the fathers are never allowed to be detained with them. There's a 30-day court-mandated limit of how long a so-called family, a mother and a young child, can be detained for. It's 30 days. It's part of the Flores settlement agreement. And the Trump administration now, well, besides not abiding by that 30-day limit, is trying to implement what was called a binary choice, where the parents can either agree to be deported with their children, or they can stay on and fight their case, but their children will not be kept in detention anymore. So their children will be taken out and put in the custody again of Health and Human Services, but the mothers will stay in detention. Mm-hmm. And there it's this just, if you are acknowledging that these people may have an asylum case to make and claim and may be granted it because they fear persecution and death or torture in their home countries, but you're making them do it while they're potentially being separated from their children. Again, that is well thought out, well argued, written down, poured over by government attorneys policy that is intentionally forcing parents to either give up on their asylum claims, face death or persecution at home, or be removed from their children.
So I feel like this question is stupid, but I'm going to ask it. Have these policies enacted by the Trump administration in particular, has it done anything to deter people from trying to enter the United States as asylees?
Yes and no. There are people who have gone through it. At this point, Arnoves, who tried 3 times, who went through this with his daughter, whose daughter is still living down and probably will be the rest of her life, this trauma. He right now is he and his family are not doing well, but he is right now is facing the possibility of that persecution, that death that he fled, because he's willing to potentially sacrifice himself because he's not willing to take his daughter with him again, nor is he willing to be separated from her. So there's some cases like that of people who have gone through it where I think it has worked as a deterrent. And there are other cases where there is, misinformation or lack of information about the reality of the cruelty that detention entails, or the difficulty of crossing the border at this point, where people are still leaving their homes and heading north to the United States, from Central America or Mexico. The pandemic has changed that. And, we saw and we've seen so many different efforts at cracking down, beginning really in the 1990s, but it went back before that as well, where they tried to turn the border into a deathscape. And they did. And they intentionally forced people to walk across the desert to, wade across a river that has claimed thousands of lives. They did that knowing or hoping that it would deter people, and it didn't. The Obama administration expanded family detention to deter people, and it didn't. And even if you look at before the pandemic, child separation, was enacted in starting, February, March of 2018, and expanding in the subsequent months. That fall, you saw a huge increase in number of border crossings, even families with children. And so that didn't deter people either. Right now, I think people are staying at home for different reasons. But, so in individual cases, I would say, yes, it has worked as a deterrent. And sometimes there is a chilling effect that, the Trump administration and other administrations have celebrated, that there's been a slight downturn for a couple of months. But in the end, the reality of these people's homes, or people's lack of homes, or people's inability to find and make a home and feel safe in their home, forces people to leave their homes. That's human nature. So no, I don't think in the end it's going to have a deterrent effect. I don't think deterrence works. I think enacting policies that undo the incredible harms that we've been waging against these countries for centuries in some cases is the only way to keep people at home or to provide a home for people. There was, I think of this quote, which I mentioned in the book a lot, from Hannah Arendt. And she said that what was unprecedented in the 20th century was not that people were leaving their homes, but that people were unable to find a new home. That a little bit of a paraphrase there. People have always fled their homes. People throughout history, seasonal changes, internal or international conflicts. There's always been something to drive people out of their homes, and it's not always violence. Sometimes it's migration for other reasons. And yet, what is new and really we saw a change and a huge increase in this in the 20th century, which has been called the century of the refugee. I think that was, a little bit early. I think 21st century really will be the century of the refugee. But what we saw that starting then was a huge concerted crackdown and a refusal to let people resettle and find new homes, even as we implemented these resettlement regimes.
Right.
Or resettlement programs, sorry.
What I really wanted to do there with John is to highlight the human side of this, right? Because with those interviews with Noam Chomsky and with Henry Giroux, there's a human element to what they're talking about. Obviously, they're talking about human beings and the experiences of human beings under these regimes. We're talking about, the U.S. empire. We're talking about neoliberalism, its impacts on human beings within the United States and outside of the United States as well, of course. But that part with John, I really wanted to feature that because, one, I was very moved, very, very moved by that interview with him, his book. It's definitely worth reading. And even though we're past the Trump administration, what he explored in that book and what he has also explored in his journalism is incredibly relevant because this isn't just a Trump administration issue. I know I'm going to focus a great deal on Trump himself and the administration under Trump. The fact is that all the tools that Trump had at his disposal to do the things that he did under his administration, he didn't just make that up. He didn't just pull that out of thin air. There's precedence here. As John mentioned, family separation is not new. It was definitely enacted in a much more comprehensive and dramatic fashion under the Trump administration. But as you mentioned, this happened under Obama. And as things get worse, as the climate continues to become increasingly destabilized, as the long-term impacts of U.S. foreign policy on Central America and other parts of the world, as that continues to play out, we're going to continue to see mass migrations of people that are seeking safety, that are seeking security, which is what anyone would do under those circumstances. See, this is what I find so pernicious about the rhetoric around immigration. And I see this in the explicitly xenophobic and racist language that the Trump administration used, or other Republicans use in particular, but also just how Democrats also approach this as well. This is not a partisan issue. This is a bipartisan effort to create and perpetuate a regime of dehumanization for mass migration, for those that are seeking asylum. That's only going to get worse as the decades proceed, as we continue down this path, as things continue to collapse, as things like climate disruption continue to play out into the future. We're going to continue to see large groups of people coming or attempt to come up through the southern border. And I think if we have any compassion, any understanding, any sense of human empathy, we would not allow this type of thing to occur. So whether we have a full-on far-right fascist regime come into place, or whether we continue to have this sort of neoliberal authoritarianism, that aspect of it, the way that we treat migrants, that will stay the same. And I think what's important here when we talk about the trajectory towards an actual fascism in the United States is that the groundwork has been laid for it. The dehumanization of people that are not citizens of this country, who are especially are brown, that come from the global south. These people and how they're treated is really a litmus test for what is going to occur in the coming decades as we continue to see a more reactionary right-wing takeover of the institutions of the United States. And that it won't stop with migrants. It's not going to stop with people that are undocumented. It's going to extend far beyond that to other groups of people that they view as a threat to the legitimacy of this regime, of this state of affairs that we are currently existing in. That's where we're at right now. And so to sort of further this point, to talk about the ways in which language and the way that politicians and those in positions of power in any given nation uses language and begins to frame issues in a specific kind of way and formulate forms of propaganda in order to further certain goals they have, they end up scapegoating whole groups of people. They end up scapegoating whole ethnic groups or different demographics in order to, again, further a political or economic or social agenda that they have. To discuss this, I wanted to feature a segment of my interview with Leah Babayan. Leah is somebody that I've had on the podcast several times. She is a good friend of mine. I've known her now for about 3 years, I think. She is an Armenian refugee. She's a local business owner, and she's an activist. And she is the author of the memoir Liminal, a refugee memoir that was released in late 2018. In the interview, we discuss her book, which is a really profound and disturbing retelling of her childhood experiences fleeing the pogroms enacted against the Armenian minority population in Baku, Azerbaijan, in the midst of the collapse of the Soviet Union from about 1989 to 1990. So what I wrote here for that was, after experiencing incomprehensible trauma and dehumanization, Leah and her family fled to Armenia, where they were homeless for over 3 years. She recalls the hostility and derision with notable punctuations of deep generosity her and her family experienced from her fellow citizens during this time, as is too often the case with displaced or traumatized refugee populations around the world, regardless of the context of the displacement for each respective group. After this period, Leah's family was finally granted the refugee status required to make their way to the United States, ultimately resettling in Twin Falls, Idaho, through the College of Southern Idaho Refugee Resettlement Program. While Leah and her family were fortunate enough to be able to escape the horrific violence in Baku and their desperate living situation thereafter, their difficult journey towards integration and healing was only just the beginning. So the book, I think, it records her experiences and provides a means for those that have been fortunate enough to have never experienced this side of the human condition, to A, more fully empathize with the plight of refugees around the world, regardless of the context of their displacement, B, understand how trauma informs the development, emotional, mental, spiritual, and so on, of children and adults alike, and how that trauma is passed intergenerationally if it is not reckoned with and processed on the individual and community level. C, understand how the dominant cultural, political, and economic institutions lay the groundwork, regardless of the socioeconomic structure and nation they reside within, for these grand acts of barbarity that occur against vulnerable populations. D, to identify the forms of language used and policies enacted by the political class that pave the road for these violent dynamics to emerge in mass societies around the world, of particular relevance in the United States presently, in order to counter these dehumanizing narratives and create spaces for inclusion, understanding, and healing. And E, provide the forms of support refugees need that run far deeper than just financial economic support provided by refugee resettlement programs and the like, wherever they may be. Okay, that gives you a rundown of the fuller interview, but in particular, what we talk about is, as I talked about, the forms of language used, the policies enacted by the political class, and how that really paves the way for these kind of authoritarian regimes to justify acts of extreme brutality and barbarity against specific groups of people.
There's definitely someone profiting off of chaos.
Yeah.
And so, being that Baku is such a rich, resourced area with oil, and there's just so many geopolitical reasons why instability there would be beneficial to other powers and other nations. Maybe that was a massacre that was useful for what they were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, it's really a cynical move. I mean, it's like using underlying ethnic and religious tensions to further some sort of political goal.
Yeah.
And we see this in every nation state around the world, and we see it in the United States right now.
Yeah.
That's
what I was about to say.
Yeah, and
we see that here. Playing on finding a scapegoat to blame all the problems on, and then delivering on a gold platter the solution or that scapegoat.
Yeah.
And then just basically saying attack right there.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing that here, and that's what's so scary about it, is that even what my family went through, it began with words and sentiment and jokes and the grooming
like culture
of
wars and stuff like that.
That and like the grooming of intolerance, which seems so benign and just so casual, and it's just it's just small talk or whatever. But what it does to us as human beings, and how it touches on a spot in our primitive brain, I think, for survival and fear and mob rule and mob mentality. I mean, it's a tactic that works, and that's why a lot of our political leaders will use it throughout different times of history to accomplish a goal. And we don't seem to learn from it because, one, there's the politics of denial, which feeds that cycle. If there's the politics of denial, then we don't acknowledge what was done as an injustice to a group of people. So then we don't take it accountability. So then it further, grooms our intolerance towards that group, making it easier for us to dehumanize and victimize that group again. So the politics of denial is right there happening at the same time as the dehumanizing of that population. It has to happen like parallel. No, that's not what we're doing. We're not dehumanizing them. Like, they broke the law.
Yeah,
like,
right.
No, we're not. No, that's the consequence. That's what we do when people break the law. So it's just like justifying it.
It's like
constantly.
with they call them detention centers, but I like to use the term concentration camps because I think that's more of a real accurate term. We should call things what they are. But that we see on the border here in the United States, and it is that process because it's like so if you go back, so even just a few years ago, they weren't doing it at the scale they're doing it now necessarily, or with the same kind of cruelty. I mean, it was still very cruel. I think what people need to understand, that this is a long-standing tradition. Previous presidencies and administrations have enacted similar measures, but under Trump, it's sort of a new level of dehumanization that's happening. And so, you go back even a few years ago, people were using the same excuses to justify the dehumanization of these people trying to leave war-torn or wherever they're coming from South or Central America. And so now we're at a new level where, all the information that's coming out from detention centers, these camps, and people are still using the same kind of language to that politics of denial that's like, well, if only they did it this way or this way or this way, we wouldn't have to do this. But it's like the cruelty is escalating, and the same denial is being implemented to justify those actions. And so it's, I imagine for you, for me, it's like, this is new. Like, this is a part of my life. I haven't had these experiences to draw upon in previous experiences. So I think having your perspective, I know you've been pretty active in speaking up about that and doing what you can to draw attention to it.
Yeah. There's very little I could do about it, but I know that the biggest thing that I can do is one day answer my children, what did you do about it?
Yeah.
And that to me is so much more important than anything else. Is being able to face my own children. We worship together. We practice our faith together. My children know the values of not just our culture, but our faith, our spirituality. And so if I am asking them to walk a certain walk with the values I'm instilling in them, but then I don't demonstrate that as an adult to them, how can I look them straight in the face, in their eyes, and feel a connection, feel an honest connection with them?
Right.
I can't do that. I don't know how other people can do that, or if they do that, but I can't do that. If my children ask me, what did you do when this was going on? Just like if it was during the Holocaust, if someone would have asked their parent, well, what did you do?
Yeah.
How could you just stand there?
Yeah.
How could you not be affected by it? Even if you can't do something, what did you do? Did you demonstrate? Did you say something? Did you write a letter? Did you vote a certain way?
It's like the bare minimum.
What did you do? Yeah. Did you lose sleep about it? Did you hurt? Did you care? I want to be able to answer my children in a very honest and real way, and in a way where it aligns and reflects and reinforces our Christian beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, and our values in our family and in our culture.
Yeah.
So that I think that's like what we talk about all the time as a society. That's what we value as a society, and I hear Christians talk about it. That we're called to, be humanitarians and witness and live a Christ-like life. I cannot imagine Christ or any other prophet or savior or any other religion's spiritual teacher and leader just kicking back and turning off the TV when that's going on, or saying, well, they should have followed the law. We're land of laws.
Right.
I cannot imagine that. I cannot imagine that. Like that, I don't know if that's the religious leader's response. Then I don't want to worship that God.
Yeah.
There's something I wrote in my book for my children, which I think is how I'd like to guide them and raise them. And it says that it's in the beginning where it's the dedication, and it says what's ethical is not always legal, and what's legal is not always ethical. And my prayer is they do know the difference in their heart. And I feel like there's times in society and there's times in our country, nation, world, where we're stepped up to defend our human ethics above law.
Yeah.
So that's what we're called to do as human beings. If we need the law to tell us how to be human, we've reached a very dangerous point.
Yeah.
If the laws is what keep us accountable to one another, keep us humane and ethical, like if it's only the law that keeps me ethical to you and keeps me from like destroying your property and hurting your children, then we've reached a very dangerous point in our society. There should be human, ethical dignity, decency that's led by the soul that is way before any law.
I really value my friendship with Leah. I really value the book that she wrote, Liminal. I really value that she was able to articulate through the broader interview, which is a rather long discussion with her. We recorded that in her backyard back in, I think, 2019. It was a beautiful day, and we sat out there, and she told me about what it was like to survive a pogrom, basically, and to become a refugee, her family escaping an extremely horrific situation. Those conversations with Leah, I've had numerous conversations with her. I've had 3 interviews in total with her, I believe. And each one of those have been very moving and have really helped me, as somebody who's never had any kind of experience resembling anything like that, to have a better grasp on a side of the human condition that if you live in a particular place at a particular time and have a particular set of privileges, you're just never going to see, such as myself. And I think Leah, being in the position that she is with the experiences that she's had, has had to work through a lot of trauma and has had to find her own path forward in being able to not only work through and with that trauma, but then to begin to express her experiences to an English-speaking audience here in the United States. Because I think, especially in this time we're in, we are undergoing certain crises in this country. Some of them are very cultural. They're seemingly abstract. They're not necessarily material. But there are definitely material changes and material crises that we're experiencing as well. And those things working in conjunction can be the perfect breeding ground for a kind of dehumanization of whole groups of people, a scapegoating of whole groups of people, as Leah pointed to there. We talked, of course, about what John in the previous segment before that discussed, which is the mass detainment of migrants seeking asylum in the United States. I really want to make it clear, and this is something that Leah talks about as well, is that this kind of language, the type of rhetoric that someone like Trump engaged in, is a way to further an agenda. And by scapegoating whole groups of people, that is definitely one of the steps that's required to move towards a more authoritarian and fascist state. And as things begin to disintegrate, people are seeking a truth. The common stories and myths and narratives that people have held onto in this country, the national myths and stories that people have felt comforted and secured by, are beginning to be challenged really, really directly. I mean, we started to see that especially last year with the George Floyd rebellions. All of these things that began to manifest over the past year, especially, and over the past several years, and then, of course, you can extend even further back through the decades, you can really see that the United States as an empire is collapsing. It is certainly the most powerful country in the world still, but nonetheless, it is experiencing its own decline. And the mass psychology of the U.S. American population is being affected by that. And the dominant culture in this country does not do well with their common illusions and delusions being challenged. And I think that's partly why I feel personally that fascism, which has existed in this country for a long time, or at least the nascent beginnings of a fascism, have existed in this country for a very long time. And it doesn't seem that far-fetched for it to kind of blossom into something fully realized in the coming years. I don't think it's at that point yet, but I do think Trump was something of a harbinger of what is going to come in this country. And we need to act accordingly, and we need to examine our morals and our ethics, like Leah pointed to in that last segment, in order to prepare ourselves for what is happening currently and what is going to be happening in the coming years as this thing unfolds more and more. So we're going to take a little bit of a turn here. I want to feature a segment here that is going to get into the philosophical, metaphysical underpinnings of what is currently happening. And this extends far beyond the United States. This is something that I think the West, as it were, has been contending with for some time now. This interview is with Gary Lachman. So Gary is a prolific writer, and he's a historian, and he's the author of numerous books on the evolution of consciousness, popular culture, and the history of the occult. We recorded this interview actually just like a week or so before the election last year. And we talk about two books in particular. And the most important one that we talk about regarding what is discussed in this segment is Dark Star Rising: Magic and Power in the Age of Trump. And I'm going to quote here from what I wrote about this episode. In Dark Star Rising, Gary Lachman delves into the occultic and esoteric influences that inform contemporary politics and power in the postmodern age, with a particular focus on the rise of Donald Trump in the United States and Vladimir Putin in post-Soviet Union Russia, as well as those who stand in the shadows of these figures, exerting their influence through subtle and not so subtle means. When the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche proclaimed in the 19th century that God is dead, he was anticipating the approach of an age of nihilism that would redefine life in the Western world. Truth itself is up to interpretation, to be defined and continuously redefined by those that seek and have attained political power and influence in our postmodern age. How does the occult, positive thinking, and chaos magic inform political power in our post-truth era? And we discussed this in this interview. So don't be thrown off by the occult and chaos magic and all this. Certainly this is some esoteric stuff, and certainly in discussing this, Gary has delved into some of the more cultic elements of this, but the important thing to talk about here is what is truth? We do get into the philosophy of this, sort of the post-truth era that we are living in, postmodernism, how we have entered into this sort of age of nihilism as Friedrich Nietzsche described back in the 19th century, and how this has informed a figure like Trump to come into power. I think this is really important to understand as we get further into this part of this very long episode, to understand the metaphysical landscape that gives rise to figures like Trump.
The idea for me is that we entered this period where, from a variety of different avenues, the notion of reality, or there being a stable reality or a stable truth, with a capital T, or reality with a capital R, that's available and objective and verifiable, for everyone, that kind of got flipped over. And this, one of the key examples of that for me was Trump. This, because after Trump, we that's when we started hearing about post-truth and alternative fact. Okay.
Yeah, fake news.
And it struck me from a variety of different sort of sources. One of them is kind of postmodernism, this notion of, which itself says there isn't any stable reality. It's all, different philosophies and beliefs are temporary, and you can put, adopt them and drop them, and you can change around. You can throw a bunch of stuff together and see what happens, and it's all this kind of playful, let's not take it too seriously. It's all manipulable. And then Trump himself is a devotee of positive thinking, which you can see is a kind of form of magic. It's kind of mental science in the sense where you use your imagination to visualize some outcome in the real world. So that's another way in which reality is malleable, and you can manipulate it, towards your own ends. And then what really got the book going was that my editor, Penguin at the time, asked me if what did I think about this? Is that this is what I start the book with. This is back in 2016 after the election. Trump won the election, and Richard Spencer, who was the head of the alt-right then, and I don't even think we hear about these people anymore. I personally have not been, I haven't had my ear, to the web and is it still going on, that kind of thing. But they seem to have dropped out all of that kind of scene. But at the time, back then, 2000, leading up to the election, and then he was in the news. And this whole idea that, he gave this talk at the annual meeting of the National Policy Institute, NPI, which was considered by many to be a sort of white supremacist organization, and at the Ronald Reagan building. And he starts this meeting by saying, "Hail Trump, hail our hero, hail our leader," things of that sort. We made this happen. We made this dream come true. You know, we made this a reality. And all that was picked up by the regular news, media, and it was on CNN and all that, because the people in response were giving these Hitler salutes and all this kind of thing. But there was a blogger who wrote about the New Age, a fellow named Harvey Bishop, and he pointed out that it sounded like who wrote about about New Thought, which is a sort of variant of positive thinking, or it's under the same kind of umbrella, this kind of mental science, And he said it sounds like the alt-right and Richard Spencer are saying they've used New Thought techniques somehow to get Trump into office. So I thought, okay, so I followed this up. And then the strange thing was, like, from that, I learned that Trump was a devotee of positive thinking, which is a branch of New Thought. And then also other things started to turn up that started to make this kind of pattern of a variety of different sort of what you would call magical or occult kind of influences behind, working in the background. And the kind, what do you want to say, the sort of the instrument that Spencer and the alt-right were supposed to have used was on the internet. And they had this meme of Pepe, Pepe the Frog, who starts out as this innocuous kind of slacker amphibian, but he goes over to the dark side when they get a hold of him, and he becomes this kind of symbol or sigil or a kind of magical kind of meme that is helping Trump get elected. And they saturate the internet with all these images, and then the idea is that reality is supposed to echo, or reality. If we make it happen on the internet enough, it'll bleed over into the real world, and so on. Right. So I mean, I just saw other things, that were part and parcel of that, and not only in the States but also in Russia.
Right.
So that was kind of like, yes, there is all this stuff happening, but it's not like there's a cabal. I'm not saying there's a cabal of kind of black magicians behind Trump doing this. It's just that there seems to be, from a variety of directions, different ways of thinking that kind of celebrate the loss of this notion of a kind of stable, fixed reality that it's available for those who know how to manipulate and control.
Right. Yeah. No, I got that real sense. I appreciated that as like people could maybe read it and be like, "Wow, this sounds like some vast conspiracy theory," but the way you approach the subject isn't like that at all. It's just how actual reality works, which is that we influence one another, and some people have enormous influence with their philosophies and writings, and it informs the general. Like, I was reading an essay you had published on your website last night, and you were talking a great deal about Nietzsche, and how he had predicted very, very accurately that we were entering an age of nihilism, essentially. And the amount of influence that he had, it's not that he created or he made that we, the West has descended into a state of nihilism. He just could read the room, so to speak. He kind of had that extra sense of like knowing where it was leading. And that in turn influenced other philosophers to kind of elaborate on that point and maybe take it further. So in a general sense, I mean, you can't say that all these philosophers are in on a conspiracy to like,
no, it's sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, it's not like they're in a conspiracy to like undermine the values of Western civilization. They're just observing something, and then they put those ideas out there.
It's not like for Nietzsche. Nietzsche was very disturbed by this. It wasn't like he was celebrating it.
Right.
And this is like there's a lot of misreading of Nietzsche, and he gets appropriated and so on. And the sad thing about Nietzsche, and the tragic thing, and the prescient thing, is that he knew this would happen.
Right.
But in his last days, when he was in his last days of sanity. He wrote in his autobiography, Ecce Homo, which is one of the strangest books ever written. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
But he says, do not mistake me for someone else. And he knows, and that's exactly what happens to him. First, his sister is the first one to do it, and I mentioned that in this essay. No, the essay is called Trickle Down Metaphysics, and from Nietzsche to Trump, and it's a spelling out of a phrase I use in the book. I just say in a paragraph, because I say, academic kind of disciplines like postmodern, or well, not only academic, but movements, postmodernism, deconstructionism, kind of paved the way for post-truth and alternative fact, because they've been whittling away in the academy for decades at the kind of Western, logocentric, fallow logocentric, structure of dead white European male oppression and blah, blah, blah. And this has been going on now for decades. And so gleefully, they're, deconstructing the notion of this kind of truth that was hitherto, or reality hitherto, kind of, uses an oppression against a variety of other, more diverse points of view. But
Right.
by the time but the way I tell it in the essay, it starts with Nietzsche. He sees it coming in the 1880s. And he writes in his notes that later become, he had this idea for this huge magnum opus he wanted to write, called The Will to Power for a while. Then he titled it Revaluation of All Values, but he never got around to actually writing it. But he collected an enormous number of notes. And after when he went mad, his sister, Elizabeth, basically put these notes together and kind of said, "Oh yes, this is my tragic brother's masterwork." But it really isn't. It's a fantastic book, but it's his nachlass. It's like the stuff that's left over, that didn't. So in any case, but in there he says, I see this, this specter on its way, as it were, and it's nihilism, and it's unavoidable. And for Nietzsche, the irony is that the very pursuit of truth in both, say, the spiritual, religious, Christian, and let's say the philosophical, Platonic, which later becomes sort of the scientific, has led to this revelation that there is no, objective truth, and with a capital T,
right,
or reality with a capital R. It's all from a perspective. And this for him is terrifying, but it's also liberating, because it gives us the opportunity to revalue things, to have a more, for him, Nietzsche, more adventurous kind of, way of living, the gay science, the fröhliche Wissenschaft and all that sort of thing. But he knows that he's way ahead of his time. And, there's a variety of different ways in his writing where, Zarathustra comes too early, the people in the marketplace aren't ready to hear him. Or he says in the Antichrist, I don't write for today or for tomorrow, I write for the day after tomorrow. So the immediate, the shock of the death of God, and the recognition that, what we would later call the meta-narratives that gave meaning to human existence are no longer tenable. And the sort of the hangover from that, which is the nihilism, is the sense like, well, if these values were not true, then no values are true. And Nietzsche wants to overcome that. But he sees immediately that's not going to be able to happen. So he's speaking out for like a few generations ahead. And but the next one who picks it up is Martin Heidegger, the great German philosopher. And he takes Nietzsche's ideas, and he too sees this kind of nihilism on its way. But its source for him is we made a wrong turn at Plato. The pre-Socratics who are the early thinkers who were open to the question of being. They felt the question of being in this immediate, almost visceral kind of way. But then with Plato and Socrates, we start to develop this whole attempt to come up with rational explanations for existence and all of that, and so on and so on. And then that's still, I mean, for Heidegger, it's still a kind of burden in the way that it was for Nietzsche. But I mean, Heidegger, he's in the university, in the academic world, so he's not completely the wanderer out on his own as Nietzsche was, out on the ledge,
right,
out on the edge, absolutely by himself. And then by the next sort of generation, the 60s, 70s, you get people like Derrida, who they even want to go further. So Heidegger said what we needed to do is dismantle Western metaphysics. So we have to take apart Western philosophy and to get back where we made this wrong turn. And by doing this, we will, arrive at this kind of pristine experience of being, which he still posits as there's a kind of content that's there. There's a something. I mean, later on, he calls it presence, Anwesenheit. But when you get Derrida, he even says, no, there's not even that. No, there's no presence. There's just an absence. There's just difference. So it's like a completely, white kind of, everything's been erased off the blackboard
Right.
now.
Right.
And it's no longer this kind of, it doesn't have this threat, this notion of existential threat that this idea of nihilism, first had, for Nietzsche, and then, it was something to overcome. It's celebrated in a certain way. I mean, I'm not saying Derrida is necessarily saying celebrating nihilism per se,
Right.
but just the kind of celebratory atmosphere that, at least my experience of it when I was in university and I was reading this stuff of deconstructionism and postmodernism as well, was that, yes, we're taking down this old edifice of the Western tradition. And initially it's kind of liberating, but then after a while you realize it doesn't have anything to put in its place. There's no content.
Yeah.
And that's when the kind of the nihilism is kind of like, okay, but by our time, it's trickled down from Nietzsche's lonely mountaintop to our Twitter feeds and, what we watch on television. And it's something we just pick up, and it's kind of like, whatever, man. Oh, really? We're not really, I don't think we're, whatever we are now, the post everything era, we don't seem disturbed by the same kind of threat that I would say that this notion of this kind of emptiness
Right.
of the universe and all that we just kind of accept it. And there's a variety of things that at an earlier time seemed to be rather troubling to like the existentialists that I just feel like we don't, they're not like, oh, what's the big deal?
Well, I think this whole approach of we live in a so-called post-truth era, postmodern deconstructionist era, where figures like Trump can come in and basically create such a chaotic situation that he can then actually bend reality to his will, to his benefit.
Well, that's what he was taught to do.
Exactly.
Being a devotee of Norman Vincent Peale.
Yeah, and that was actually that was like my next line of thought, was to actually ask you, because so I just want to say this really quickly, which is you talk about this individual, Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, as being a major influence in Trump and being a part of the new thought or the kind of positive thinking. Now, my first exposure to this type of thinking was from The Secret. Which my father was super into, and he had me watch. I didn't read the book, but I watched the documentary about it, or whatever you want to call it, the little film about it. And even as a kid, I was like, this doesn't...
The infomercial.
The infomercial, there you go. Because to call it a documentary doesn't seem right.
Right.
But just the idea that, you think about something and you think about it positively and you set your will to it, reality will like rearrange itself to accommodate that. And I was like, okay, well, that sounds nice, but I don't know. It just always something felt like was completely excluded from the whole thing, which was like the systemic reality of the systems we're a part of, which, like tell a person who's starving to death on the streets or whatever, will yourself out of this, and it just felt really wrong to me. But you get into the deeper roots of this line of thinking. I hadn't known until reading your book that this has been around for some time, this type of thinking. So if I could ask you about that, just ask you about this individual that influenced Trump, and the kind of the framework, how it works, what it is as a philosophy or an approach to life, and kind of the deeper roots of it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, the kind of, let's just say, practical, utilitarian kind of approach to it, where you want some outcome, or you whatever it might be, from a new washing machine to a better job or something. I mean, that in a way is a kind of shallow way to approach this, but the notion that in some way our inner world is involved in the world that we experience outside. I mean, this has a long sort of philosophical and spiritual prestige, and I mean, it goes back to Emerson, in one. I mean, it goes back to the ancient Greeks and Hindu philosophy as well, but in American context, I mean, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American essayist, he actually coined the term New Thought, and he has this whole notion about being able to visualize and create I mean, he doesn't talk about it in that sense, but create your own reality in that kind of sense. But he does talk about the way in which you can have success in the world and self-reliance, and also the notion that our thoughts do sort of shape the world around us in a certain way. And Emerson is this quintessential American. It's the new world. He's cut ties with Europe in the past and all that. And so it is a very kind of American can-do sort of sensibility. And William James, the great American philosopher and psychologist in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was called the mind cure then. And it was, sort of a variant of Christian Science. But again, it was, the whole notion that what we would call psychosomatic kind of illnesses or conditions, where thinking positive thoughts, thinking in a particular way, can actually help someone get over a physical malady. And James himself employed some techniques because he had angina and a variety of other sort of nervous conditions. And at one point, he even lobbied for. He lobbied against. There was the American Medical Society or something like that in Boston wanted to ban access to this kind of mind cure literature because they felt it was a danger to the public and all that. And James lobbied against that and actually helped to make it available. So it has some, and many people, Henri Bergson, the great, French philosopher in the early 20th century. So unless you want to think these people were like, they were great philosophers, but, boy, did they get, the wool pull over eyes over this stuff. It does have a prestigious background, but yes, it is ultimately very simplistic. And there's dozens of, immediate questions one asks, just as you said, if it was that easy, wouldn't we, be doing it all the time?
Right.
But where Norman Vincent Peale comes into this is he grew up, he read a lot of this kind of new thought literature, say late 19th century into the early 20th century. William Walker Atkinson, a variety of others. And he gave it a kind of Christian kind of twist. And he gave these sermons in New York at the Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue and 29th Street. And he had a radio program and then a TV program in the 50s. And in the 50s, he wrote this book called The Power of Positive Thinking. And it became this immense bestseller. And it's still something that sells quite a bit. But it was on the bestseller list for like 2 years or something like that, at the top of it when it came out. And it's like a three-part sort of program, where you prayerize, you sort of pray to God, what it is that you want to happen. You visualize it as vividly and clearly as you possibly can, the outcome actually taking place. And then you have to develop this kind of sense of expectancy where it's already happened. You don't actually have to, struggle and kind of stress yourself to make it happen. It's happened already, and the results of it will turn up soon. And this was something that Peale was able to get across to millions of readers in this simple way. And it was something that Trump's father was very taken with. And he used to take the family to hear these his sermons, Peale's sermons. And then Trump himself started going, when he got older, and he had, 2 of his weddings took place there. And he says that, I mean, this is probably the best kind of endorsement you can get, is that he said after listening to one of Norman Vincent Peale's sermons, he could have listened to another one for another hour. And Trump is not somebody who's known for a very long attention span.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the fact that he'd be able to sit through another hour, that's saying a lot. So, and the fundamental idea that he took away from Peale's books is that facts don't matter. It's our attitude towards facts. This was something that Peale got from the psychologist Karl Menninger. But it goes back to the ancient Stoic philosophers like Epictetus. It's not things that trouble us, it's what we think about things that trouble us.
Right.
So you can control your thoughts. And so this is one thing, I mean, Trump, he never has a negative word. I mean, he'll say negative about somebody else. He's going to,
Sure.
slow Joe or sleepy Joe, whatever. He's going to put him down. But everything about him is upbeat. It's the best. It's the greatest. It's the most.
The biggest.
So biggest, yeah, exactly. So this is, and he has this kind of focused tunnel vision, and he says it's a kind of controlled neuroses in the sense that he's able to cut out everything else other except for what he wants to happen. He keeps his eyes on the prize, as it were.
Right.
And this is one of the things where you can see he just deflects everything around him that is not part of how he sees things. And you're exactly right when you said that he decides what's real.
Yep.
And this is why the whole idea of, in the early days, when people they were flabbergasted that he was lying so much and trying to catch him out, and it didn't matter that he lied. He knew he was lying. He was doing absolutely, but he was saying, I decide what's real in this town.
Yeah, right.
And that's how it is. And so we have the birth of post-truth and alternative fact then.
Right. Well, I think there's this thing about with the rise of someone like Trump, it spits in the face of I guess the underlying values of a liberal democracy, which is that the idea that, like, I'm probably really oversimplifying this, but the idea that the best ideas will rise to the top. If you have the best argument, the best kind of set of information and data, and you can argue your point well, you will win the debate, and that'll be the thing that guides us towards a better future or whatever.
Yeah.
So we kind of set up a political system around that idea, and then you have someone like Trump who absolutely doesn't care. You can't.
A good myth.
Yeah, you can't argue with him to convince him of anything, and his followers won't be convinced of anything either.
All of these other, earlier kind of strong leaders had a myth, and it was a Hitler, the race myth, whatever, the master race myth, and Mussolini, it was the kind of trying to relive ancient Rome, and this is something that's part of that sort of political philosophy of the demagogue.
Right.
So it isn't about rational argument. And you're right. If you assume that this discussion is taking place in a sphere which accepts, the criteria for rational argument and all that.
Right.
But once that's gone, then it doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
And I think the thing with Trump, and this is what I say in the book about people like Mussolini and Hitler, and not to make any kind of relation between them that strong or that obvious, but just the sense that they didn't win on rational arguments. They had an emotional appeal. They fulfilled an emotional need.
Yes.
They satisfied an emotional need to belong to something.
Right.
And this is what Trump is doing. The MAGA movement and all that sort of thing.
There is a spiritual void in the heart of this place, this country. I think it's something of an abyss. And instead of looking into that abyss and acknowledging this and looking into this and where that may have come from, which would be a form of self-examination that I think most people are incapable of and unwilling to do, instead they will attach themselves to figures that make grandiose promises of a greatness that is waiting for us and waiting for them. And anyone who stands in the way of that, anyone who points to anything to the contrary, is a demon. They are the antithesis of everything that you believe this country should be and is. I think that this sort of hollow space that resides in the hearts of so many people in this time is the space that allows for something like fascism, a sort of fascism, to emerge. I'm providing something of an oversimplistic, generalized view of this, but I feel it. I feel it viscerally. I understand, I think on some level, through my own curiosity, my own work, personal work, and with the relationships that I've cultivated over the years, the work that I do with this podcast to try to understand what that void is and where it comes from. And I will say this very clearly, I know I have one inside of myself as well. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But nonetheless, with that being the case, I think there are many people in this time and in this place that refuse to look at it. And this nihilism, this lack of real meaning and purpose, this capital T truth, lends itself to authoritarian demagogic figures taking control. And I think what Gary Lachman pointed to, I hope, provides a deeper philosophical perspective. And some of this is going to be mentioned with this interview I'm going to be featuring here with Jared Yates Sexton. So Jared Yates Sexton is a political commentator. He's the author of American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People. And this is the second time he was on the podcast. I featured him in part 3 of this series, talking about the pandemic. We talked about QAnon in that interview more specifically. That's how I became aware of him, was his really excellent analysis of QAnon. I invited him back on the podcast right after the election. I remember that time frame, the 2-month period. It was very tense. There was a sense in the air that something big was going to happen. Trump was not accepting the results of the election. This was an unprecedented move for a U.S. president to do so. And I had a real sense that who could know what would actually unfold. Now, I didn't have faith that the system itself would be resilient enough to deal with this. It was, ultimately. And I'm not here to, say I love the system or anything, but I just want to be clear that, the alternative to the system being resilient and holding up against this sort of push was that he would steal the election and we would have a sort of far-right autocrat in power. And that, to me, is just not a good alternative, So in this time frame, I was a bit worried. So I had, of course, been following Jared Yates Sexton's work and felt like he was really an appropriate guest to have on the podcast during this time. So I'll just quote here the description from the episode. What does politics look like and feel like in our postmodern era? Jared and I begin this discussion with that thought, that question in mind. In the United States, we are about a month out since millions of citizens cast their votes in the presidential election, a contest between incumbent President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. Biden, having now decisively won in both the popular vote and the Electoral College, presently awaits to be inaugurated president in January. While this may be objectively true, President Trump has refused to concede and admit defeat, instead doubling down and reinforcing claims that the electoral process was somehow fraudulent and illegitimate. Anyone who has paid attention to Trump and his allies over the last few years, and especially over the last several months, should understand what is happening and the real danger posed here. While Jared concludes that under current conditions an electoral coup is unlikely, the mere fact that it is being attempted at all, with so many deeply embedded establishment politicians unopposed to it, should raise our concern. Trump may not succeed in overturning the election, but what comes next from him and his fascistic base is of deep consequence. I will just say that what I wrote there at the end is deeply relevant to the segment I'm going to be presenting here. The fact that there were so many people, particularly liberals, that were in such denial of what was going to happen, of what could happen, is as much of a problem as what Trump was attempting to do. People were not concerned enough, in my view. And ultimately what happened on January 6th could have been worse. It could have been significantly worse. I mean, I think we talked 4 or 5 months ago or something, and we were talking about QAnon. That was the main focus of the interview.
A lot of stuff has changed since we talked.
Yes, and I think just the nature of the year that we're in. I mean, things have just been moving and changing so fast. So yeah, month to month and even week to week, it's just trying to get your head around all the things that are happening. And I think with the election, and now we're post-election, obviously Biden won by a pretty significant margin. It's it's not really can't really contend with that in a logical way, but this just seems like the far right now is in that illusionary world. But I also see that what I want to say the left exactly, but I would say liberals tend to be okay, well, all the things we were worried about with the institutions of democracy in this country being subverted by Trump and the Republican Party and all that, those held up. We're fine. Biden's going to be in January, and we won't have to listen to Trump anymore, or we don't have to deal with his bullshit anymore. And my thought for months now has been actually this time period, whether Trump won or not, would be one of the most dangerous periods leading up to the inauguration, right? I think these 2 months are really, really crucial. Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts about just how, I guess, liberals and Democrats and those types have kind of reacted to the election and kind of averting their eyes a little bit from what Trump and his cronies are doing right now? Yeah.
Well, it all sucks. Is what I would start by saying. Is it just sucks. The whole thing sucks. I was trying to tell people America has this really terrible way of looking at politics. We treat it like seasons of a TV show or seasons, in like a sporting league. And it's like, yeah, we won the Super Bowl. Now we get to celebrate the Super Bowl. And it's like, that is not how power works, right?
Yeah.
Like the reason why Joe Biden beat Donald Trump was because the country said, we want off this ride. This new avenue that we have taken sucks, and it's destructive and it's bad. And it wasn't like there was some sort of coalescing force among the Biden campaign. It was much more of I am not Donald Trump. We need to reject this and try and move back to normal. Well, normal isn't great. And normal got us Donald Trump. And there is a long-term sickness in America that led to Donald Trump. And so now, like you said, everyone's like, well, yes, Donald Trump did try a coup, but it appears like the coup is not going to work. So everything's fine. And that's the craziest thing I've ever heard anybody try and articulate.
Yeah.
Like we're sitting here today. It's Wednesday, December 2nd. I live in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And Trump's very, very brief lawyer, Sidney Powell, was just down the street from me today at a rally that said that the far-right Republican governor, Brian Kemp, should be arrested, and saying that, there's this big, giant conspiracy. It's the New World Order, QAnon madness. And meanwhile, Trump, I believe today, or maybe it was yesterday, said they should throw out the election results. Mike Flynn and another group have said that we should suspend the Constitution under martial law and steal the election. And I want people to understand, and this is what I've been trying to tell people for the past few months, electing Joe Biden president is an opportunity to breathe and do the hard, necessary work to get rid of this problem. Right. It didn't solve the problem. It kicked the can a little bit down the road so we could try and catch up to it. But we have, and listen, the president of the United States tried to carry out a coup. That alone should scare the living hell out of everybody. The fact that one of the major parties was fine with it, that the media ecosystem was fine with it. And by the way, our financial systems were fine with it, which is not something that anybody wants to talk about. I mean, a coup's been like, somebody's been trying to carry off a coup, and meanwhile, the stock market's going crazy. Uh-huh. The fact that it was attempted and the fact that it gained traction and it gained favor should tell everyone that there's something really wrong in our system. And it's becoming apparent to me by the day that Donald Trump is actually a precursor to something worse. Mm-hmm. Than Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. I mean, try to wrap your head around that. And on top of that, that the situation is ripe for whatever that worst thing is. Like all of the ingredients are there for the worst thing to come along.
Yeah, it's like he's shown future potential leaders, I guess, or leaders. Maybe there's people right now. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's some fucking senator or representative or some
a Tom Cotton, so to speak.
I mean, someone who's already in positions of influence and power in the U.S. government, U.S.
or Ted Cruz, who believes that he was chosen by God to do what he does. Mm-hmm. It's any number of people.
Yeah, it's just, and like you said, kicking the can down the road. That's a great way to put it, because it's like, what if the coup is unsuccessful, and it may very well be unsuccessful as far as getting to that endpoint of it actually being successful. But the fact that we had a president that had been dog whistling to far right militias for years, we have a president that has indicated for years that this election would be fraudulent. I mean, he was just laying the groundwork to prepare everyone for the possibility of what's happening right now. And yeah, Trump might get kicked. He might leave in January, and might not be as dramatic as we were fearing it would be. But yeah, like you said, I mean, it's just opening the door for. something else. I mean, our so-called democracy will not recover from what's been going on, you know?
Well, I just want to show a little bit of the trajectory of what Donald Trump has done to our politics, right? Mm-hmm. Donald Trump, and I always try and explain to people, because we try and explain Donald Trump and we're like, oh, it's 5D chess and he's trying to do this, he's trying to do this. No, he is a runaway id who's just flailing at all times, right? Mm-hmm. Like he, and occasionally he finds weaknesses and he's like, go, we're doing that. That's weak. We're going to, use that to our advantage. Mm-hmm. Well, in the very beginning, it goes back to like October of 2016. Actually, it was on my birthday. I don't need to mention that, but I feel like I should. It was on my birthday, when the Access Hollywood tape came out. And what did Donald Trump show everybody? That shame is an elective thing in politics. If you don't apologize for something, and if you don't feel bad for it, nobody can like really hold it against you. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like if you play in bad faith, like who's going to stop you? Right? That's what, and it's shown that it's ripe for that. And all along, he's shown that with corruption. I mean, with impeachable acts, with one crime after another, with these cruelties, with every democratic institution that he's either challenged or completely corroded. He has laid out a plan for literally anyone who is somewhat more competent than him. Because the main problem here is that Donald Trump was transparently incompetent and weird. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like he was just incompetent enough and just weird enough that even the media was like, something's not great here and this kind of sucks. If he would have been more competent and less weird, I think that they would have just lapped it up because they tried to. Mm-hmm. They were always like, oh, I think he's going to pivot. I think today's the day he becomes president, all of this stuff. Meanwhile, this whole idea of reality, you have to, I'm glad you brought up the militias. We have like far-right domestic terrorists in this country. We have separatists in this country. We have a lot of really dangerous people. You and I are sitting here talking about, and by the way, you said QAnon. It's really important to bring up QAnon, which I assume that everybody who's listening is like, oh, that QAnon stuff is like crazy as shit. Who could possibly believe that? Yeah. Well, that's true. But all it takes is, like, the whole idea is that there's going to be a military operation that goes out and arrests a bunch of people, right? Mm-hmm. That's the QAnon thing. Mm-hmm. Well, all it takes is a bunch of military types to go out and arrest a bunch of people and hold trials, and all of a sudden the thing that you thought was bananas suddenly becomes reality. Or, in fascist countries, they lie all the time, and they enforce the realities on other people, and then beat them, attack them, kill them, until their reality becomes the majority view. The whole point is that this thing is always in the balance. It's more precarious right now than it has been in America, probably at any time in recent history. This has to be one of the most dangerous moments in modern American history. And people feel like it's safe now, and it's actually more dangerous today than it was the day before the election.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that appalls people about Trump is they cannot understand. This is why it's become such a big, I'm just going to say this, it's just so divisive within personal relationships, is it's like, like my mom or people that I know that I'm close to, and they're like, I can't understand why this other person likes Trump and why they voted for him and why they buy into it. Like, he's so glaringly, like you said, it's just so fucking obvious. It's just right there. It's so gross and disgusting, and yet people are just lapping it up. And so I understand why the optics of a Biden presidency is more appealing for people, because they're like, oh, finally we have a president that's decent and blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, there's still these like neoliberal warmonger assholes. I don't see it as a positive thing. I just see it as like, yeah, we know the nature of this beast. The Trump thing is a little new for many people, I think. It's like, for me too, I mean, you know what I mean?
I think there's also something weird that is happening, and this goes back to the postmodern thing that we started out talking about. Yeah. I think that there's been a shift in thought that is a little weird, and I've never talked about this out loud, but it's something I've been mulling it over. I don't know if you remember this, but back in the olden times when I was young, you would go to like a gas station and they would have that container with like the slush in it, the slush drink,
Yeah.
and it would just constantly be churning, and maybe you got some. This has been churning around in my head, and maybe this is where it comes out the right way, or maybe I totally fail. I don't know. I'll take it for a walk.
Okay.
I think that politics has reached a new stage. I watched the movie Gremlins the other day, and I haven't seen it in a long time. And it's like, you start out with like the Mogwai, and then all of a sudden you have the Gremlins. It's like the stages that they take. I think politics has reached a new evolutionary stage. I don't think countries really exist anymore. I think corporations exist. And corporations are their own organisms that grew out of countries, and now they're sort of like global, and they don't have anything to do with borders. They've sort of gotten rid of that. And meanwhile, a lot of us are still talking about nations. We're still talking about presidents and elections and all of that. And that's not what these people are worried about. They're beyond that. Well, I think Trump supporters have reached a different point in reckoning with that than the rest of us have. I think Trump supporters have, in a way, gone ahead and embraced nihilistic postmodernism. I don't think they understand it. I don't think that they could explain it. But I think it's like saying, yeah, that wall is built. The wall was never going to be built. The wall was just a metaphor,
Yeah.
And Trump can say, I made all these jobs, I did all these things. I think deep down they understand that that's not true. I think they know Trump lies. They think it's funny that Trump lies. They think it's funny that he doesn't tell the truth. But it's a symbolic victory, going back to what we were talking about. In a way, they're voting for the symbolism of what it would mean to have a president who did the things that they wanted to do, as opposed to a president who actually did those things. Right? It's like, yes, we do have a wonderful wall, and what a wonderful feast we have, although there's no food on this table. Like, we can imagine this. I think the left, to a large extent, still is expecting their vote to end in results. Right? Like, if you vote for the right person, if you win the right election, suddenly there will be a substantial change in politics. Like, I think a lot of people on the left look at Trumpists and they're like, how do you not know he's lying to you? And the Trumpists are like, we don't care.
Yeah.
We turn on the TV and the president is there and he tells us we're great and we're wonderful and the country is great. I think on the left, there are a lot of people who sort of still believe in a system that can be totally saved by means of incrementalism and by means of just sort of like dialing things back a little bit and again, making the right choices. But I think it's going to be, I about said fascinating, but I don't think that's the right word. I think it's going to be a little bit terrifying to see what happens if we continue down the road where the results aren't real, they're symbolic. And I think Trump was probably a glimpse. It's like every now and then, like an athlete comes out who is like so far ahead of everybody else, and suddenly everybody else has to catch up with them. I think Trump was really far ahead in terms of postmodern nihilism. And I think it was such a glaringly obvious thing. And if we don't change course, I think we're going to start to recognize what that thing is. I think we're going to grasp it later on when it's too late.
So I think you can sense from the trajectory of how this is playing out so far with this part of this very long episode. These interviews are recorded pretty quickly within this time frame. I think I was feeling fairly anxious about what was going to happen. I had a sense something was going to happen. I think Jared alluded to that. And I think, especially with everything that has played out since the election, since Joe Biden was inaugurated, of course, what happened on January 6th, and in the months that have preceded since then, right? We're now in the summer of 2021. It seems like Jared was very prescient. I think he was pointing to something that is true. I think, since Trump did what he did, since the Republican Party embraced this approach to politics, yeah, we're in a different time now. things have changed. So we're going to move on to another interview that I recorded in this same time frame, and that is with Marjorie Cohn. Marjorie is professor emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law and former president of the National Lawyers Guild. And I asked her in this interview that was recorded back in December to discuss President Trump and his legal team's ongoing attempt at that time to perform a, quote, electoral coup since the presidential election in November of 2020. She describes in detail the legal challenges Trump's team had made in those several weeks and the likelihood of whether their success in undermining the results of the election in states across the United States would be successful. So we're going to get into a bit of the legal elements of this. I was wondering how to include this because this is most definitely a part of what I think is very important about this time. We had all of these legal challenges. Trump was, of course, trying to challenge the election in all these various states, the results of the election. So she's going to go over the details of that. So some of it's going to seem like, man, we've already gone through this. Why do we need to reiterate this point? I still think it's important, just for the record. I think it's important to know the ways in which Trump attempted to overthrow the results of an election and how that process unfolded. And I am going to present this segment of our interview, and there's going to be also some other audio I'm going to throw in here for dramatic effect in order to really build on this point of, I think we all felt something was going to happen. Inevitably, something did, and that is what happened on January 6th. Then after that, I'm not going to be saying anything. I'm just going to move into a segment of a podcast that I had started last year with a group of friends, Jeff Cole, Forrest Palmer, and Mike Sleva. Title of that podcast is Attack and Dethrone Godcast. It's a silly name, but it was a podcast that we started, I think, because of a lot of the things we were seeing last year leading up to the election. I think we all felt a sense of like, wow, we really need to have conversations about what we were experiencing and what we were expecting to happen. So after this part with Marjorie, I am going to be playing a segment of one of the episodes we recorded right after the Capitol siege to kind of illustrate what we all felt after this happened. I mean, all four of us together tend to agree on things as far as where we're going in this country, where we're going globally, whether we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the rise of fascism or authoritarianism or whatever. We're all pretty much on the same page when it comes to that. So I think that's really important, actually, in this time that we're living in, having people to have conversations with about these things so that you feel like, okay, I'm grounded and that we're all seeing and feeling the same things. I think that's extremely important right now. I'm very lucky and fortunate to be able to do this work and to have made all of these incredible connections with people. In doing this podcast over the years, I've had people reach out to me and say things like, this podcast has allowed me to feel more grounded. Maybe the words that they would use is more sane or something like that. I don't really want to use that word exactly, but, something along those lines of feeling like reality itself is fragmenting. Our sense of what is happening is so confused and difficult to maybe take in. We're all dealing with it a little differently, but I think a lot of us that are observing and feeling what is happening, we really do need to find people to at least talk to about these things. And I hope in doing this work, in putting together this series and doing all the interviews that I've conducted and released over these years, that if you don't have those people in your life, that you at least can listen to this and feel some sense of camaraderie in this. That is my goal, at least. That is one of the goals that I've had in doing this work. And that has been one of the gifts that have come out of doing this, is to meet this time and face it, and to be able to prepare ourselves in all the various ways that we need to prepare ourselves for what is coming and for what is happening. So yeah, I'm going to be presenting this interview with Marjorie Cohn, and then we'll be moving into, right after that segment of that podcast with Forrest, Jeff, and Michael. I just want to ask, I mean, you wrote that Trump is attempting an electoral coup. I mean, how would that even be possible, and how is his team or his his administration or campaign attempting to pull off a coup. How does that actually work, and what's actually happening in regards to that?
Well, for months, Trump was preemptively setting the stage to claim voter fraud. He knew that Democrats would by and large vote by mail ballot because they were careful and didn't want to go to the polls and subject themselves to the coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
And his supporters, whom he encourages not to wear masks and not to socially distance, would go to the polls. So he began claiming that there was going to be voter fraud, that animals were going to vote, that dead people were going to vote, that mail ballots were fraudulent. And of course, we've been voting by absentee for years with no problems at all.
Sure.
And voter fraud has been proven to be a totally specious concept. But then when the results came in on election night and it looked like he was ahead because the mail ballots hadn't been counted, he claimed victory and said, let's stop the counting. And of course, as the counting went on, Biden won, and he will not accept that. So his legal team have filed frivolous lawsuits. They started alleging fraud. And then when judges, even Republican judges, were throwing them out of court saying, where's the evidence of fraud? They're limiting it to technicalities, but none of these things would really change the outcome of the election. So then his next line of attack was to delay the certification of the votes, to keep the certifying boards, the certification boards in the various counties and then states from certifying the election. Well, that didn't work. Big law firms were withdrawing from representing him. The Department of Homeland Security said it was the most secure election in American history. And the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency was fired because he said that there was no manipulation of the electoral system. Now, William Barr, his attorney general, who has walked in lockstep with Trump from the beginning, even before the beginning, and done his dirty work, said he didn't see any massive voter fraud. And that was after the election. And Trump strong-armed him. And so he put out a directive saying that his prosecutors could investigate substantial allegations of voting and vote tabulation irregularities. But just recently, a day or two ago, Barr said there is no massive voter fraud. There's no evidence of it. So Trump is furious with him. He may well fire Barr, even though there's only 7 weeks left in Trump's term, just to punish him because Trump is so vindictive.
Sure.
And so basically, the Constitution gives the state legislatures the power to decide how the electors are selected. And the federal code requires that electors be chosen on election day. But it says that when a state has failed to make a choice on election day, then the electors may be appointed on a subsequent day in such a manner as the legislature of the state may direct. But the states didn't fail to choose the electors on election day because as a result of the voting process, which ended on November 3rd, Biden won more electoral votes. And there was some manipulation going on. Two of the Republican officials on the 4-member board of canvassers in Michigan's largest county that includes Detroit voted against certification of Wayne County's vote count. But then after a powerful public outcry and accusations of racism, they backed down, reversed their no votes, and then unanimously certified the tally. Meanwhile, Trump called them and spoke with them, and then they tried to rescind their yes votes, and the governor said basically that's too late. So that didn't work, and the electors have been certified for Biden. So now this is what's going to happen now.
Okay.
On January the 6th, the House and Senate will meet in a joint session. The newly constituted Congress having been sworn in, and they have to pass judgment on the Electoral College vote. The Electoral College vote will be on the 14th of December and will go Biden's way. What will happen is that a very tiny number of Congress members have the power to challenge the results on January 6th. And Mike Pence, the vice president, will preside over that joint session of Congress. If a single member of the House and a single member of the Senate object to the slates of Biden electors, then the House and the Senate retreat to their chambers, debate for 2 hours, and then vote. And each state's electors are separately certified. So if the Democratic run House, which will vote to uphold the Biden electors, and the GOP controlled Senate disagree, that's never happened before, but that will probably give the governors in key states a larger role. And there are Democratic governors in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So it's a real long shot that this would happen, that Trump could actually get Congress to go his way. And the other thing about the Senate is that it's going to be very closely divided because Mark Kelly was sworn in, a Democrat, took over from a Republican, and the senator who is up for re-election will probably not have taken his seat, the one in Georgia. So it's going to be very closely divided. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and I think Mitt Romney have all said they're going to uphold the Biden electors. So I think it's a real long shot that the Senate would even vote to withdraw the Biden electors. And if, it conceivably could end up in the Supreme Court, and that's what Trump was banking on when he rushed the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett on the court to achieve a 6-3 right-wing majority. But that's probably not going to happen. And so it's David Perdue is the one who's probably not going to be taking his seat because he's up for re-election. So I think it's a long shot. And since no lower court, even courts with Republican judges, have found voter fraud, and the Trump forces stopped alleging fraud because the judges were yelling at them and saying, there's no evidence of fraud. But since there are no lower courts that have said there's fraud, I just can't imagine the Supreme Court, even with the right wingers on it, taking the case. So I don't think that this is likely. And moreover, in the faithless electors case earlier this year, the Chiafalo versus Washington case, the Supreme Court unanimously said electors are not free agents. They are to vote for the candidate whom the states have chosen. Now, Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch indicated in a Pennsylvania case that they might want to reconsider the issue that was raised there, which was about extending the period of time to receive mail ballots. And who knows about Amy Coney Barrett. But I just don't think that there's going to be a majority of the Supreme Court, or 4 justices, which is what it takes to review a case, to agree to review this case and possibly hand the election to Trump. This is not like Bush v. Gore, where it was a very close election and the election turned on a little over 500 votes. This is a different situation. So I think that he is out of luck there. Now, he can refuse to concede defeat. He can refuse to leave the White House. He can refuse to attend Biden's inauguration. He can continue to insist that he beat Biden. He wants to keep control of the Republican Party, and that's why he's using the money that donors are giving him to defend the election to fund his new PAC, so he can keep control of the Republican Party, because he said he wants to run for president in 2024. And the other thing that is most worrisome is that Trump could telegraph to his right-wing white supremacist militia groups to mount an armed rebellion. Hopefully that is not going to happen.
Yes, I hope that doesn't happen as well.
There's got to be something in here we can fucking use against these scumbags. I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election.
Are there any objections to counting the certificate of vote of the state of Arizona that the teller has verified appears to be regular in form and authentic?
Mr. Vice President, I, Paul Gosar from Arizona.
For what
Sports
purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
I rise for myself and 60 of my colleagues to object to the counting of the electoral ballots from Arizona.
Pause. Thank you.
Without objection, the chair declares the House in recess pursuant to Clause 12B of Rule 1.
They don't fix this shit. We're going to fucking one fucking day. Millions of Americans are armed
to protect the Constitution of the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic.
It's sad. It's sad. Let the people in.
Fuck you, police!
There's a fucking million of us out there, and we are listening to Trump. You're the boss.
Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray. Amen! Start making a list, put all those names down, and we start hunting them down one by one.
Traitors get guillotined.
We are at war.
I know how you feel, but go home and go home in peace.
You know what? I'm going to tell you gentlemen something because I have a lot of respect for you. But when I first saw that the Capitol building was being hit, I'll tell you the same thing it is that I wrote on my particular space that I have on Facebook. No, I take that back. Validated isn't the right word because I don't look for validation from any person. This vindicated everything as I've read in the past 10 plus years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Period.
Yeah. It looked a little less crazy today.
Yeah, when I saw that, I wasn't even shocked. When I saw these people actually going to the Capitol building and fomenting and everything it is that our current president has said about this election process, it didn't shock me.
Yeah.
And to be quite honest with you, even though I said that it vindicated everything as I said, the reason I'm on this podcast with you gentlemen is because I know it didn't shock any of you guys either.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm slow at these things. Like, 9/11, one plane hit the building, and then the next one I was like, oh, another dumbass hit a building. And then, like this thing, I'm like, oh, there's people like rappelling up walls of the Capitol. That's different. And then it like dawned on me, I'm like, oh, yeah, this isn't good. And then I go into analysis mode.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I was like doing errands that day, I was like doing my thing and I'm like getting messages from Jeff and like in our little group chat. And I'm like, oh, there's like 10, 20,000 people that are at a rally. Trump's doing a rally. I'm like, that's a lot of people. Okay. And then you start seeing videos of people walking up to the Capitol. And I'm just like, what?
I know. I was like, people like they're doing CrossFit.
Yeah. Like trying to climb like zombies trying to climb the sides of the walls and like, and like, yeah, I'm trying to like, yeah, I'm doing my day. It's such a surreal thing to be like, I have to go to the grocery store. I've got to go do all these different like normal things. And I'm like, our Capitol building is literally being invaded by white Al-Qaeda or whatever. I mean, it's just like I mean, I agree with Forrest in the sense of that, like, we all knew this was going to happen in some form or another. Cause it's like that funny meme I saw. It's like so many good memes have come out of this, first of all. But it's like, oh, that escalated over the course of 4 years. Like it didn't escalate quickly. This has been building for 4 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if anybody's like, oh my God, like how is this happening? And I'm like,
They've literally laid the groundwork for years for this type of thing to happen.
It's like a right-wing orgasm.
Which are terrifying.
Right. Yeah.
I don't want any right-wingers having orgasms anymore.
No. No, those are bad.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, to set the scene, like I was following this like on 3 screens that day. Okay, I had a stream of inside where they were doing the certification of the Electoral College, with Mike Pence speaking, and then I had a feed of the Trump rally that was across the street from the Capitol, and then I'm following Twitter. Okay, so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, this is going to get interrupted. And I'm not going to be surprised if they at some point have to evacuate. Now, as I'm watching the Trump rally, this motherfucker directs the crowd to take the Capitol. He points for them to go over there. So I'm thinking, oh shit, here it comes.
He's like Babe Ruth.
And I'm scrolling Twitter, and I'm seeing these videos of fights with the police and everything else, and then it's like oh shit, it's on, right? And then as the day went on, you start learning that there was that this was coordinated at the highest levels of government with the Trump administration. The Department of the Defense stood down, refused to send the National Guard in. There's since been there's like something like 15 to 20 officers of the DC force under investigation. One's already been arrested, and you just start thinking like holy shit, like were these pardons by Trump of these Blackwater operatives, in their massacre in Iraq, was this some sort of quid pro quo related to fucking this day? Was Eric Prince and Blackwater somehow related with this? Nancy Pelosi's laptop goes fucking missing. Meanwhile, you've got, this siege of the Capitol where these motherfuckers get in there and taking selfies. They're not masked up. They're not hiding their identities. They're in there taking selfies and walking off with goddamn Nancy Pelosi's pedestal and shit. It's like, it's just wild,
Okay.
And then like we're seeing this unfold in a similar way to the pandemic, where we're being gaslit into thinking like it's no big deal.
Right.
And suddenly it, after a fucking insurrection, now the GOP wants unity. It's it's like, fuck, man,
dude,
where does this go? And it ain't pretty.
I just love seeing all the Republicans after that happened, trying, finally like verifying the votes or whatever. And you had like Lindsey Graham, like, oh, all right, I guess, okay, everybody, all right, I'm sorry, we gotta move on. I'm like, you fucking coward. You are so good. Oh, they're such cowards. And all the fucking people on there, like these assholes, they did the thing. They did the fucking thing. They filmed themselves doing it. There was even this fucking a guy in the House of Representatives live streamed it, and he was saying his name in the third person during the live stream.
He's like a wrestler.
Yeah, I'm in the house, and I'm just like, you oh my god. And then now they're all just like, no, that was Antifa. That was Antifa that did that. And I'm like, you guys can't even fucking own it. You can't even own it. Oh, they're cowards.
When you guys are done, I want you guys to finish your thoughts. When you're done, I want you to ping it back to me, and I'm gonna tell you something that's very funny to me.
That's a lot
you
of
guys
pressure.
done?
Yeah, say your thing.
Okay,
take it, man.
Let me tell you something about being black in America.
Okay.
I don't know if I will ever have to be relegated to doing something that's quote unquote illegal here in America. But let me tell you something, the one thing I'm not going to do is live stream it on Facebook, Twitter, and the whole nine. That is white privilege.
Yeah. Yeah.
The fact that you actually take video and put it up where everybody can see you and not have any fear in this world. To be quite honest.
And be an elected representative.
Exactly. Exactly. You feel like you can do anything and nothing is going to happen to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a white privilege jubilee.
If I'm in a to be quite honest with you, in this capitalist system, I might be desperate where I have to do something that I don't want to do. That's it. To however long it is that this capitalist system exists on this planet, I might have nothing to hurt somebody, but I might have to do something like rob a bank or whatever. And if I ever have to do that, the last thing I'm going to do is give the details on our podcast. I might go do it and come back, but you'll never know.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll watch Heat first. Watch Heat, and then we'll do it.
The fact that they took pictures and posted them online is a direct indication as to why white privilege and the feeling that you are above the law has been sacrosanct here in this country for the existence of its entirety on this planet.
Yeah. I agree. Is there an aspect of this, though, that just these people are also really dumb?
Yeah. Dude, they're brainwashed. They're in a cult. They thought that like
they're really dumb.
Yeah, like they just sauntered in like zombies. They just thought like, oh, we're having a revolution.
Yeah,
I guess.
I mean, that girl that got sprayed in the face, like, I was trying to start a revolution. I mean, they sprayed my face.
Yeah. I love that bit. It's so good. She's just like crying.
Oh,
God. Like, what happened? I got maced.
Ma'am, what happened to you?
I got maced.
You got maced?
By the police.
And what happened? You were trying to go inside the Capitol?
I made it like a foot inside, and they pushed me out, and they maced me.
What's your name? Where are you from?
My name is Elizabeth. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee.
And why did you want to go in?
We're storming the Capitol. It's a revolution.
Oh my God. Yeah.
You couldn't make it up.
Yeah. I am disappointed to find out, though, that one of the guys that died, the story was that he tased himself in the balls and had a heart attack. That turns out that's actually not true. I guess he did have a heart attack. I know, right?
Yeah.
No, it's just fake news.
Yeah, that was a downer.
Yes, good point, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, the one thing though is there was that one person who was trampled to death, and they had a "Don't tread on me" flag. So that was
Is that true?
Yeah, I think that is true.
That was true.
Oh, good.
I know, right?
You gotta hang on to my narrative.
Having that conversation with Mike, Forrest, and Jeff, that was a cathartic thing. I mean, all four of us getting together to have these conversations is always a good experience, I think, for all of us. I think we all pull something out of it that's meaningful for us, and especially after that event, which was very disturbing to watch. And what was disturbing as well, and I think this is really important to note, and this is why I think what is happening in the wake of that event is just as important, if not more important, than what actually happened on that day itself and what led up to it. We saw, of course, Donald Trump got impeached for a second time, and I watched the Congress decide whether they were going to prosecute Trump after he had been impeached by all the Democrats and maybe a few Republicans. And the ways in which the Republican Party has moved in this direction where they cannot allow even an event like this to become not only an impeachable offense, but something worth prosecuting a president or former president for, really does speak to where we're at right now. It's not just that this is partisanship, that there's the Republicans that just will never throw one of their own under the bus, especially Trump. Well, they will throw some people under the bus if they don't follow the party line. But when it comes to this event, what happened on January 6th, the event was so obvious what happened. It was so obvious what led up to it. And they have continued after this event occurred to attempt to gaslight everybody and say that, no, it didn't really happen the way you think it did. Even though some of these Republicans that were in the Congress that day were running for their lives. They were just as scared as everybody else. So it really speaks to where the Republican Party is right now. The fact is that most of the people that showed up to the Capitol that day, they weren't a part of any sort of organized thing, right? There wasn't this like revolutionary organization that was happening here. It was just a bunch of disaffected, delusional, angry, very disoriented even people that did exactly what Trump led them to do. And once they got there, they really didn't know what to do with themselves once they got there. There were elements of the people involved in this that did have some sense of organization, that did have an agenda. They knew where to go. You know, more and more information has come out in light of this event showing that there were people planning to put pipe bombs, to kidnap various Congress people. There was very legitimate concerns that if the timing was off just a little bit, you know, they really could have rounded up several of the legislators and maybe done things to them, execute them or whatever. Now, again, this isn't about me being, I'm not for these politicians. I don't like them, but I think nonetheless that event, you know, having a right-wing so-called insurrection on the Capitol is indicative of what's possible now, of where we are going and what could possibly happen in the future. And the fact that there has been very little to no accountability of how individuals within Congress and those within other departments of the U.S. government were complicit in allowing this to happen. There was a reason there weren't enough police on Capitol Hill that day. You know, there was a reason why they were able to get into that building and why this extremely unlikely event became very likely. That is worth paying attention to and worth noting how high up this really went. And again, I think that that's my true point here, is that when we talk about the rise of fascism in the United States, we certainly have the grassroots element to it, which to me is not as organized as you would need to actually have a true fascist kind of uprising or something like that, as we have seen in previous fascist takeovers. But there are definitely elements within the U.S. government and the governing bodies of the United States that are keen on bringing about a true authoritarian state, and they would be very keen on having an autocrat like Trump stay in place and stay in power. And I think that just, again, that speaks to the moment we're in today. So after this event happened, I, of course, was looking to interview people to try to make sense of what happened. The next person I would like to feature is journalist, activist, and researcher of far-right movements, Spencer Sunshine. He's been on the podcast a few times previous, and he came on to discuss what I described as the MAGA siege on the Capitol on January 6th, what led up to it, and what to expect from the far-right as we transition into Joe Biden's presidency. This was recorded, as I said, right after this. I released this on January 20th. So this was right as the inauguration of Joe Biden was occurring. He had written some articles to discuss this event. And to quote from the description I wrote for this episode, I asked Spencer about the escalation of far-right terror in the United States over the past year, culminating in thousands of Trumpists invading the U.S. Capitol on January 6th with murderous intent. As he stated in a recent article published the day after the event, quote, "The dramatic events yesterday at the U.S. Capitol further open worrisome possibilities for future far-right violence and disruptions. An escalation of aggressive actions seems likely, especially in the remaining 2 weeks of Trump's term, but the effect may last much longer. However, there is also the possibility that both this and similar recent events could further widen the internal fissures on the right to the detriment of the Trumpists." End quote. Unfortunately, these acts of violence by the far right have steadily increased over the past several years. In the aftermath of the Capitol riot and the Trump presidency, Spencer expects a continued escalation of far right terror in the U.S. over the coming months, and he explains why. So I just asked Spencer, who's done a lot of really deep, decades-long research into the far right in the United States, to explain what we can potentially expect as the months proceed. Now, I think what we're seeing, as I mentioned before, it is a combination of what's happening on the ground level, but we're also seeing the clamping down by the Republican Party. And I think that that's happening in the legislative body of the United States. And I think that that's of note. And I think we need to understand the trajectory that we're heading down here in the U.S. And I think Spencer Sunshine at least provides at least his insights into what we can expect in the coming months and years. Based on what's happening now and on previous the trends that you have observed over the years, what can you kind of anticipate how do you think they're going to react under a Biden administration, for instance, and with their favorite president leaving office? my sense is that they're going to engage in more acts of one-off terrorist events almost, or things like that. I'm just curious, like, based on your understanding of the far right and the behavior of those on the far right, like, what can we expect with that?
I think all the monitors are expecting a wave of terrorism or other, close to it actions by people on the far right, by disenchanted Trumpists, because they no longer have they no longer can use mainstream politics as a vehicle. So they're going to use, extra parliamentary tactics. And they believe, the belief that the election is stolen is really going to fuel these things, because they truly believe it. Like, this is the thing. Everyone at that demonstration in D.C. believed the election was stolen. They all just believe a fabrication with no evidence, right? And that's a very dangerous situation. Obviously, the far right people are going to go into, some of it's going to depend on if these independent Trumpists can keep a political, stream together, and Trump's role in this. The militias, they're obviously going to move in an anti-Biden stance. I mean, the left has done well the last 4 years in an anti-Trump stance. So organizing against another political faction is often, useful, or it's not always the best, but sometimes it's very good. The militias are probably in the best position to take advantage of this. Historically, they've kind of gone down under Republican administrations, but they've been able to hitch their trailer to the other groups that supported Trump, and they're generally anti-federal government, and they've downplayed this or really kind of dropped this under the Trump administration, but they'll be able to, and those are their core talking points, political talking points, they'll be able to bring them back up to the fore under Biden. So I think they're going to be the group that is most likely to benefit from this. I don't think the Proud Boys are going to do very well. I think people are going to be like, you had your moment and we're done with the violence, just a general deflation of Trump. And the others, will see what they do. I mean, I hope the QAnon stuff just goes away. It may linger on as a conspiracy theory and get into conspiracy circles. It's sort of a conglomeration of past conspiracy theories, though. All this stuff about secret pedophiles and Satanists and stuff, these are long-standing right-wing conspiracy theories,
Right.
So QAnon acts as like a bowl to put all kinds of existing currents in it.
Right.
So we'll see. Those are the things that I can pick out the most, coming up. I think a lot of people who entered the fascist movement, and this is an interesting thing, over the last 4 years, it's the first time in the U.S. we've seen a fascist movement, a big one, a revival of it that's not explicitly neo-Nazi. Like, there's some Nazi elements, but it's much more undifferentiated. Like, people like Richard Spencer, he's not a neo-Nazi. But he's a fascist. We haven't seen this kind of thing lately, but they'll create a new generation of fascist activists that will continue for a few years. Like, those kinds of things tend to have ups and downs, and when they have ups, it sort of revives the core activists with the new generation and makes them younger, so the other ones don't age out. So it doesn't age out altogether.
Right. Could you elaborate on that point a little more about how Richard Spencer is not a neo-Nazi but is a fascist? I mean, I understand there is distinctions between these two things, but I'm curious, like, what are the distinctions? Like, you're saying a real fascist movement has really emerged in the United States, but it isn't explicitly like a neo-Nazi ideology. So could you explain that a bit and differentiate the two?
Well, I mean, people already know this if you think about it. Mussolini was a fascist, but he wasn't a Nazi. Nazism and neo-Nazism are one kind of fascism. So if we're talking about the actual fascist movement, not someone who may act like a fascist like Trump or something, but, it's a coherent movement. It's existed since, some people argue, since the late 1800s, certainly since the late 19 teens, early 20s is when Mussolini came to power. So, I mean, neo-Nazis act in a specific way, have a specific discourse, often look a certain way, and Richard Spencer's not part of that. Neo-Nazis criticize Richard Spencer, and most of them don't like him. Spencer is much more like a traditional white nationalist, and there has been long-standing tensions between neo-Nazis and other white nationalists. I mean, I consider neo-Nazis one kind of white nationalist in the United States. But there's a lot of tension between the different factions, so a lot of them don't like the neo-Nazis. Nazism produces this reaction from people that all white nationalism doesn't. The Jewish community in particular is much more incensed specifically about Nazis. Not that in general they like white supremacists overall,
right?
But Nazism is particularly homophobic, is particularly, anti-feminist, is particularly anti-Semitic, and is particularly genocidal. Whereas other kinds of white nationalism may be like, oh, well, we just want second-class citizenship, or, for non-white people, or, other, more milder forms of what their goal is and what their rhetoric is, and tend to shy away from, endorsing genocide and things like that.
Sure.
And there may not be a big difference in the end to most people who are outsiders, but, it's like people on the left would never group together anarchists and Trotskyists and third world Marxists who are entryists into a popular organizing group, right? We would see the distinctions. So
sure.
the far right and white nationalists have those same distinctions too, even though it might be a matter of subtlety and public facing, and at the end of the day they may all be kind of have the same issues that they're pushing, because there's only so many issues you can get traction with.
Right. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Thank you for elaborating on that. And my next question is, one of the big things that happened in the wake of this Capitol Hill siege coup attempt. Do you see this as a real coup? Maybe I'll ask you that. Do you see this as an actual coup attempt or something else?
No, absolutely not. If it was a coup attempt, Trump had his moment to declare himself dictator. That was his moment.
Oh,
and he didn't.
Okay.
I don't believe that the people involved, some, like a small minority may have, knew what they were doing. They clearly didn't have a plan.
Right.
Maybe a small group of them did have a plan. Maybe they had insiders to guide them and stuff, but it was clearly a very small group. The mass of the crowd, it was probably, frankly, a crime of opportunity. They were like angry. They marched there. They're like, oh, we could take these tiny group of police officers, but a lot of them, people went inside and they were taking selfies and milling around, and there was, footage of people leaving. People were streaming in and out, and people leaving being like, nothing in there. There's nothing to do. So I don't understand why that's a coup. Which part of that is a coup? If it was a real coup, Trump would have taken power. They would have set up a revolutionary council to announce that the Congress was they hereby disband the Congress or whatever, whether they had the actual power to or not. I just think it's a crime of opportunity, and the left would do the same thing. Let's just be really honest. If they thought they could storm the Capitol at some big demonstration with thousands of people, I'm sure they would.
Right. I guess the goals would be a little different.
The goals would be a little different. It'd be a lot more organized. People would set up a press office. They'd be handing out free sandwiches, There'd be a chill out room, and, there'd be more street medics. Probably all these people wouldn't have died of heart attacks because there would have been street medics. That's a clear difference. And no free food. That's the other big difference.
Right. That was one of the funnier takes I saw after this, where people were, saying it was Antifa that was responsible for the violence. And it's like, you don't know. Like, Antifa would be far more better organized, just like you said. Like, they know how to protest, so it would be far.
If it was Antifa, there would be no live streamers, and everyone would be wearing masks.
Exactly.
Rather than this is a coup attempt. They're live streaming what they're committing federal crimes and live streaming it. That doesn't seem like very together to me.
Right. Yeah, for sure. It just sort of kind of reeks of entitlement, like, I don't know how people could not think that there wouldn't be consequences. And in many ways, I understand it. Obviously, if you're a leftist and you're protesting, you're going to receive a lot more hate and violence from the police. So I think leftists that are organizing in the streets understand this a lot more. And it seems like the far right doesn't seem to have that same kind of understanding of the situation. Like, it doesn't occur with them as much, where they have police attacking them. Yeah.
It makes sense that they don't. It makes sense that they don't, because it doesn't happen to them. Why should they expect it to happen to them?
Right. Right.
So, and I think because they live, the people at this demonstration in particular because they are all conspiracy theorists or believed in conspiracy theories, like really just don't understand like what it means. I think they're like, they really believe that they were entitled to come into, in this sense, into and invade the Capitol because it was their house or whatever. And I think they really just weren't here enough to understand that how this was going to play with the rest of the country, and that, while local police may ignore certain things that you do, especially if they don't like your target as well, like that they're not going to ignore federal crimes.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think these things dawned on them.
So I will just say something here about what Spencer said when I asked him if this was a coup attempt. I think definitions matter, and, I may be wrong in saying that that was a coup attempt, what happened on January 6th, but everything that led up to it, the attempt to overthrow the election, the results of the election, all the legal challenges that the Trump presidency had thrown against the various states and counties across the country, their election results, that was all a part of a process to overthrow a democratic election. And the complicity of the Republican Party in that, and how, we're now way past that event. We're way past January 6th. The Republican Party is still pushing this lie, which they call the big lie, the idea that the election was stolen from Trump. I think it's significant to acknowledge how this event, January 6th, fits into the broader picture. Certainly, what happened on that day was not a proper coup. It didn't lead to the actual overthrow of the U.S. government. It did not cement Trump's position of power during that time. But nonetheless, it was an attempt. And I think the point is here to understand that we didn't think that anything like this could happen in the United States. I think a lot of people felt like this is just something that happens in other countries. This is what happens in other less civilized places. And I think that that's a very dangerous and very narrow way of looking at this. And racist, too, obviously. I think ultimately what we witnessed over those months leading up to the election and then right after the election was some form of coup attempt. It didn't succeed. It wasn't well organized. Obviously, the institutions of the United States, I guess, stood up to it for the most part. But it all culminated in that siege on the Capitol. And I really think that we need to understand where we're at today. I say that over and over again. I really think it's important that we understand what that all really means in the grand scheme of things. And as we meet numerous crises in this time, one of the things that we're going to have to really understand and prepare ourselves for is the possibility of an authoritarian regime taking control and doing what authoritarian regimes tend to do. I think we're already more than halfway there. Most definitely. And of course, if you're in a privileged position in society like I am, maybe we just can't see it as well as others who have lived under the boot of this empire for so long. But we've been here for a long time. And it's only going to get worse. And that's all I have to say about that. I want to move into one more part here before we conclude part 5 of this very long episode. And that is with Alex Vitale. This is Professor Vitale's second time on the podcast. He is a sociologist and author of The End of Policing. And he joined me after what happened on January 6th to discuss what happened on that day, the role the Capitol Police played in the event, and the deeply political reasons the police were under-resourced, understaffed, and completely overwhelmed in the face of the mob. And what is really important here to understand, and this is the note that I really want to leave this part on, which is to understand what is coming because of this event. I note here in the description that Professor Vitale steps outside the narratives that have inevitably emerged in the wake of this event, including the failure to secure the Capitol is due to lack of police funding and training, meaning that we need to beef up policing in a general sense, leading to more legislation to combat domestic terror by expanding the surveillance and police state in the United States, and that the police were letting rioters into the Capitol building and actively cooperating with them. And there most definitely were isolated examples of this. I don't think that's surprising. I think that the important thing to understand here with this interview with Alex is just to understand that this is a pretext that has been used to beef up policing in the United States, the same way that what happened last year with the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd was also used as a pretext to beef up policing. The U.S. government, regardless of whether we have a president like Trump or whether we have a president like Joe Biden, ultimately they're going to further enhance the surveillance state and further enhance the police state. And I think that that's really dangerous for a lot of reasons. One just being that it's terrible. I mean, there's obvious reasons why we shouldn't be doing that. but also because if another figure like Trump comes into power, they'll have even more tools at their disposal to finish the job. And I think that's what the Democrats are doing right now. They have the power to reverse some of this, and they have chosen not to do that. And they won't, because they're the Democrats. They never would do that anyway. So I think it's just really important to understand the trajectory that we're heading towards in the United States. And I'm really sorry to tell you that it is not good.
I mean, I think everybody on that day, on the 6th, we were just sort of watching, images and videos coming in. Police were being overwhelmed. There weren't enough police at the Capitol. People were confused about what was happening. People were storming it, attacking police, getting into the Capitol building. It just seemed so chaotic and so mismanaged. But based on just your initial observations that day, I mean, what stood out to you in regards to policing, at least?
Well, there started to be these little clips of videos on Twitter and whatnot where people were focused on police complicity with the demonstrators. Oh, look, they let him in through this barricade, or they let him in through this door. Mm-hmm. And that didn't seem quite right to me. And so I started to try to look more carefully at these videos. And what seemed clear to me is that in most of these videos, what police were doing was basically a kind of strategic retreat in the face of the fact that they were being surrounded. So they opened up a barricade, but only because the demonstrators had already gotten through in other places and were filling in behind them, which you don't want that if you're a police officer in a situation like this. And so they're like, okay, we're falling back. It's hard to analyze every single one of the videos out of context, but what was also clear to me was that there was tremendous resistance by the police to the crowd. I mean, there was intense fighting.
Yeah.
With significant injuries to police and demonstrators. I mean, this was a pitched battle. And so to focus a narrative around, well, the police let them in, based on these videos, just clearly didn't seem to be right to me, that at least on the ground, in the moment, the police were trying to defend these positions as best they could.
Right.
Then we got to think about, well, what happened such that we found ourselves in this situation in the first place, right? So there were clearly police failures, and I think politics played a role in that, but that doesn't really explain, you can't explain that in terms of individual officers on the front lines.
Right. Yeah, I feel like, and this included myself, I mean, I was first to jump in and assert my thought on what was happening, which is, of course, the police are going to work with these people. Of course, they're going to take selfies with them. Of course, they're going to let them in the Capitol. It's like there was that mentality that I had. And then I think once more information came in and we really had a bigger context of what happened, it changed a bit. And I realized that my own biases were getting in the way of just, analyzing the situation accurately. So, I guess now that it's been over 7 days or 8-9 days since that happened, with more information coming out, I mean, what stood out to you now since then?
Well, first, I mean, it's clear that a lot of police are sympathetic to these right-wing movements. Mm-hmm. The conspiracy theories, the nationalism, the authoritarianism, the racism. We know there were a lot of off-duty police in the crowd, and we know that many of the police on duty that day, especially among the Capitol Police, less so among the D.C. Metropolitan Police, were sympathetic, including the officer that was killed. Mm. But we're learning more about what was happening up the chain of command.
Right.
Which is where the real problem is, right? The decisions about deployments, about preparation. So you have, for instance, the now resigned head of the Capitol Police saying, I asked my superiors for authorization to bring in the National Guard preemptively and, have them available in the Capitol, and I was turned down. Mm. So in this case, his immediate superiors were the sergeants at arms for the House and the Senate. And these are, political appointments. And these folks said, no, we don't want to see military troops in the Capitol. And we now know that the mayor of DC played a role in shaping the deployment. After, ironically, right, after so much criticism about the militarized response to the Black Lives Matter protests, she's like, well, we want to take a softer touch. We don't want to seem like we're a militarized city. And so she instructs, the Metropolitan Police to try to take a slightly softer touch and to not pre-deploy, heavily militarized units. So these are political decisions happening at a high level. This is not about individual officer discretion, about whether or not to take a selfie with someone. And, one of my concerns is that, what happens in these situations is that members of Congress, political leaders, the Biden administration are going to throw some demonstrators and some cops under the bus by ramping up criminalization of dissent. And then they're going to wipe their hands of the thing and say, there's justice now. And in the process, they're going to shut down the conversation about high-level political complicity with this, including members of Congress, who are supporting these movements, maybe acting in concert with them, maybe actually involved in planning. There was some hint of this, and I don't have any evidence to substantiate this. This is stuff that should be investigated. And my concern is that a lot of this is going to get swept under the rug, as it often does.
Why would it be swept under the rug, though? I feel like this would be a really good case for impeachment, as well as just trying to rid our political system of I guess the Trumpists, those that are working. I mean, they actively were encouraging you could say call it insurrection or coup attempts. I mean, you would think, I guess I would just assume Democrats would be like, all right, this is the thing that's going to allow us to basically purge our system of these folks that really don't believe in democracy or believe in this process, and we can use this as a really good example of just how traitorous they are. The language they would use maybe would be traitorous, and we can rid them. So I guess maybe my question more is the way you framed it is what does that ultimately serve for, say, the Democrats or whoever?
Yeah. Well, see, the signal from the Biden administration was really clear right away. They did not favor impeachment. They don't favor, the Senate removing him from office. They are heavily invested in producing this discourse around being moderate, reaching across the aisle. They don't want to inflame partisan difference.
Yeah.
So they're like, we are going to be post-Trump, and now everyone can just work together. We're going to compromise, which, of course, what that is really about is capitulating to the idea that, well, we can't really give you anything. We're not really going to give you the kind of COVID relief you need. We're not really going to give you real access to health care. We're not really going to give you, free tuition or substantial reductions in debt, in school debt. We're going to give you a few symbolic things, but our job is to hold the line, to be reasonable, to be moderate, so that we can continue in power and basically continue this larger democratic strategy of appealing to the wealthy to join the Democratic coalition by selling out the poor and working class folks. So a purge of extremist Republicans in the Congress is seen as too divisive.
Right.
So you have the squad taking a different approach, right? So Cori Bush from St. Louis says, actually, I'm going to introduce a measure to expel every member of Congress who lied about the election, who facilitated these conspiracy theories. And of course, the House leadership, the moderate House leadership, is completely shutting that down.
It's amazing. It's amazing that we could have like quite literally this situation that we're in currently, and still and still they're doing that. It's like I mean, there's I don't know. It just sort of points to just sort of a real lack of I don't know. It just feels like history is repeating itself a little bit. Like we can kind of look to parallels to previous examples of dictatorships or maybe fascist movements rising in liberal democracies, and it always seems like the liberals are the ones that kind of don't really see the writing on the wall, and they don't make the right decisions when it's actually really, really important to make those right decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the concern here is that the failure of the Democrats to do anything substantial to help working people, and just overall questions of equity and justice, is going to drive more people into the extremist right. Mm-hmm. And that, the real risk is that we'll get a real fascist in 4 years, mm-hmm. And someone who's not a clown.
Right.
And who actually knows how to operate the levers of government. I mean, it's important to keep in mind how ineffective Trump was. Ultimately. I mean, he had certain horrible things he did, of course, and remaking the judiciary and stuff along the border, separating families, that's all horrible, but it could have been much worse. And his sort of clownish, hate speech and authoritarianism, cut him off from certain kinds of government actors and elite interests who weren't quite ready to go down that road with him. And we see even more of those people jettisoning him now at the 11th hour.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think what I'm seeing with the Republicans, I feel like I think there's going to be there's definitely going to be long-term consequences to this. It feels like there's a real schism that's emerged within the Republican Party. And yeah, I'm really, everything just feels very tenuous. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't have any ability to see that, of course, but it just feels like this is just a great fracturing that's happening,
Yeah, the question is how to capitalize on it, right? I think you're right. The extremist movements in particular are under assault ideologically and from the criminal justice state, right? Mm-hmm. But they have very, very broad, deep support. These movements are quite robust. So what can we do to drive a wedge between them? And it's not clear the Democrats have a real strategy. Their strategy is to appeal to the middle, mm-hmm. right? To make nice with the moderate Republicans in hopes that will pull them away from the extremists. Right. But that I'm not sure that's going to be sufficient. Because what we saw is that these moderate Republicans will embrace a Trump figure in a heartbeat if they think it'll get them some more votes.
Yeah, it seems like we've crossed a certain threshold already, or it's like we've crossed the Rubicon or something. Like, I think we're already past that point. Centrist politics just doesn't seem viable, or even strategically, like, it doesn't make sense, to me at least, and just observing it. But I really want to frame, because this whole conversation around the policing at the Capitol, it feel like there was a dichotomy there, or like a split where it's like, oh, look, you want to defund the police? Like, what are you thinking? Like, we needed more police there. Like, we need more police, more funding to make sure this doesn't ever happen again. And then you've got the other side, which is, of course, pointing to, actually, like, see how they treated them, these mostly white people trying to lay siege to the Capitol, invading the Capitol. If those were people of color, just compare this to the Black Lives Matter protests earlier this year. So there just seems to be this, like, the narrative is still there between the two. And I'm just wondering, like, how does that fit into your analysis of policing in general, and like how we can approach this particular event through a lens that, you've provided through your work?
Well, I think it's clear that the preparation for the protest was inadequate to secure the Capitol because of political sympathies among political and policing elites, to this movement. Whether it was the kind of somewhat unexamined diminishing of the threat that's associated with right-wing movements compared to exaggerating the threat that's associated with left-wing movements.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always some of that. Or whether it was a more conscious discounting of the threat. So we don't know that. We need more investigation, and we may never know, what was really going on in people's heads and in some closed door meetings.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that's interesting, though, is to see folks who were at the center of this kind of Blue Lives Matter movement literally beating police officers to death.
Yeah.
And there was a nice piece by Ryan Cooper in the publication The Week that really talks about, that Blue Lives Matter for these extremist movements was never about blue lives. It was just a tactic to attack Black lives.
Mm.
And that as soon as blue lives got in the way of their agenda, they were very happy to throw blue lives under the bus as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They didn't really have the interests of police as human beings
yeah.
in mind. At least significant sections of them really didn't.
Mm-hmm.
That if police stood in the way of their kind of authoritarian agenda or their, completely insane crackpot conspiracy theories, that police, could be neutralized, liquidated as much as any other group they're against.
Mm-hmm. So what is the solution to this? So if you have tens of thousands of raging white people attempting to storm a Capitol, and you're approaching it from a abolitionist or a defund the police perspective, what would be like the bigger question that you would maybe want to ask people or have people think about in regards to this event?
Well, certainly we want to resist this idea that's coming out of the Biden administration that we need like more domestic terrorism laws,
mm-hmm.
that we need to further strengthen political policing.
Mm.
So we certainly don't want to do that because we know that in the long run, those new powers are going to be used against the left,
mm-hmm.
not against the right. There'll be some symbolic rounding up of a few, wingnut extremists. And then very quickly, those resources will pivot to going after, Black identity extremists and Antifa and all these code words for, what is this emerging left movement in the United States. So that's the first thing. We don't want to fall down that. We don't want to make that mistake, which a lot of liberals have fallen into, right? That
mm-hmm.
they're embracing their retributive impulses of, justice equals punishment.
Mm-hmm.
I think, though, ultimately, this is about establishing, an aspirational left politics that speaks to the alienation that is such fertile ground for these extremist right-wing movements who see nothing in the mainstream Democratic Party to appeal to them. And we know, for instance, that some folks on the margins of these extremist movements were quite sympathetic to, for instance, Bernie Sanders.
Mm. Yeah.
That they would not have as easily fallen into all of these conspiracy theories and militant resistance if Bernie had been the nominee.
Right.
Because there was a sense in which he actually gave a shit about middle America and working people. Yeah. And was trying to figure something out and was going to and was not part of the centrist liberal permanent state establishment, that he was an outsider, with independent credibility.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are various reasons why Bernie was not able to pull that off. And it's not clear, who's immediately in the wings. But I think that rather than focusing all our energy on picking the next presidential candidate, we need to be building the grassroots movements that will change the politics on the ground, that will create the possibility of someone stepping into that.
All right, everybody. Thank you for getting through this part 5 of episode 300. I felt that the subjects that were explored in this part were worth focusing on, worth dedicating an entire part to, because I do think we are in a very dangerous time right now. Of course, many of the interviews featured in here were focused specifically around the United States. I, of course, am a child of this country, and I don't mean that with any pride. I just mean, just like everyone else here, I was born in this place. I am somebody who was raised within this culture, and I have seen over the past several years the trajectory that we've been going down. By no means do I think that the status quo, as it were, is working. I don't think that it works even in the best of times. I still maintain my political beliefs and my ideas about things. I think that there's obviously so much better that we could be doing with our lives, with our ability to organize ourselves collectively. And my, I think, well-founded fear is that all of the things that we have witnessed under the Trump presidency, everything that led up to January 6th, and everything that has been happening after, is pointing in that direction, that we are moving further and further in that direction. And I'm not going to say that it's inevitable. It isn't. And regardless of that, we all have the ability and we all have the opportunity to make something different out of this time. There's never a reason to not hold steadfast to your values in spite of the horrors that are unfolding right now. We have within this time the ability to build and maintain communities that can stand as a form of resistance to this kind of thing. And those communities exist, and they need to grow and expand. I think we live in a time of great uncertainty, and like I have said throughout my work over the years, the future is unwritten. We always have the choice to resist fascism under any context, and that it is imperative that we do so right now. I by no means want this to come across as a sense of helplessness in the face of this thing. These forces are very powerful, and I think that fascism is, in many ways, the inevitable conclusion to what this country is and always has been. But the fact is that whatever we choose to do in this time can stand in the face of that we can tear down and build something new in the time that we have here. Whatever that looks like, I don't know. But nonetheless, I just want to say, I just really want to thank you all for your attention, for following along in how I've presented these interviews and presented these subjects to you. So I'm going to give you my little spiel here at the end. If you want to learn more about this series, if you want to listen to the other parts, if you want to learn more about my podcast, Last Born in the Wilderness, you can go to my website, lastborninthewilderness.com. Everything you need to know will be there. If you would like to support this work on a monetary basis, if you would like to send a donation my way, you can do that through PayPal or Venmo. And go to paypal.me/lastbornpodcast and send a donation there, or you can find me at Lastborn Podcast on Venmo. If you want to support this work on a monthly or yearly basis, you can do so at Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/lastborninthewilderness. If you do that, you'll gain early access to these interviews, to these episodes before I release them publicly. To all the patrons of this podcast, thank you so much for your support. Your monetary support is definitely carrying me, and I really want to thank you for that. And for anybody else, of course, I understand if you can't do that. I know not everybody's in the same boat financially, obviously, to be able to provide that kind of support. So just listening to this podcast, sharing it with others, sending me your thoughts, all of that is enormously helpful and supportive. So thank you to everybody who subscribes to this, who listens and finds value in this. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to have a few more parts left to this series to release, part 6 and part 7. and then we will conclude this thing. Once again, thank you so much, and I'll talk to you again soon.